Chapter 21. Opposition to the Economists, based on the Ricardian theory. During the Ricardian period of political economy, its antithesis, communism of Owen and socialism of Fourier and Saint-Simon, the latter only in its first beginnings, comes also into being. According to our plan, we are here concerned only with that opposition, which takes as its starting point the premises of the economists. It will be seen from the works which we quote that in fact they all derive from the Ricardian form. Section 1. The pamphlet, the sources and remedy of the national difficulties. Subsection A. Profit, rent, and interest regarded as surplus labor of the workers, the interrelation between the accumulation of capital and the so-called labor fund. The source and remedy of the national difficulties, deduced from Principles of Political Economy in a letter to Lord John Russell, published in London in 1821 by Anonymous. This scarcely known pamphlet, about 40 pages, which appeared at a time when McCulloch, this incredible cobbler, began to make a stir, contains an important advance on Ricardo. It bluntly describes surplus value, or profit as Ricardo calls it, or interest as the author of the pamphlet terms it, as surplus labor, the labor which the worker performs gratis, the labor he performs over and above the quantity of labor by which the value of his labor power is replaced, i.e. by which he produces an equivalent for his wages. Important as it was to reduce value to labor, it was equally important to present surplus value, which manifests itself in surplus product, as surplus labor. This was in fact already stated by Adam Smith and constitutes one of the main elements in Ricardo's argumentation. But nowhere did he clearly express it and record it in an absolute form. Whereas the only concern of Ricardo and others is to understand the conditions of capitalist production and to assert them as the absolute forms of production, the pamphlet and other works of this kind to be mentioned seize on the mysteries of capitalist production which have been brought to light in order to combat the latter from the standpoint of the industrial proletariat. We read in the pamphlet, "Whatever may be due to the capitalist, from the viewpoint of the capitalist, he can only receive the surplus labor of the laborer, for the laborer must live. To be sure, these conditions of life, the minimum on which the worker can live, and consequently also the quantity of surplus labor which can be squeezed out of him, are relative magnitudes. If capital does not decrease in value as it increases in amount, the capitalists will exact from the laborers the produce of every hour's labor beyond what it is possible for the laborer to subsist on, and however horrid and disgusting it may seem, the capitalist may eventually speculate on the food that requires the least labor to produce it, and eventually say to the laborers, you shan't eat bread, because barley meal is cheaper. You shan't eat meat, because it is possible to subsist on beetroot and potatoes. And to this point have we come. If the laborer can be brought to feed on potatoes instead of bread, it is indisputably true that more can be exacted from his labor. That is to say, if when he fed on bread he was obliged to retain for the maintenance of himself and family the labor of Monday and Tuesday, he will, on potatoes, require only the half of Monday, and the remaining half of Monday and the whole of Tuesday are available either for the service of the state or the capitalist. Here, profit is reduced directly to appropriation of the labor time for which the worker receives no equivalent. It is admitted that the interest paid to the capitalists, whether in the nature of rents, interests of money, or profits of trade, is paid out of the labor of others. Rent, money interest, industrial profit are thus merely different forms of interest of capital, which again is reduced to the surplus labor of the laborer. This surplus labor takes the form of surplus produce. The capitalist is the owner of the surplus labor or of the surplus produce. The surplus produce is capital. Suppose there is no surplus labor, consequently nothing that can be allowed to accumulate as capital. And immediately after this he says, the possessors of the surplus produce, or capital, the author says in a quite different sense from the whining Ricardians, the natural and necessary consequence of an increased capital is its decreasing value. And in reference to Ricardo, why set out by telling us that no accumulation of capital will lower profits because nothing will lower profits but increased wages, when it appears that if population does not increase with capital, wages would increase from the disproportion between capital and labor, and if population does increase, wages would increase from the difficulty of producing food? If the value of capital, that is, the interest of capital, i.e. the surplus labor which it commands, which it appropriates, did not decrease when the amount of capital increases, the accumulation of interest from interest would follow in geometrical progression. And just as calculated in money, see the works of Price, this presupposes an impossible accumulation. So, reduced to its real element, labor, it would swallow up not only the surplus labor, but also the necessary labor as being due to capital. We shall return to Price's fantasy in the section on revenue and its sources. If it were possible to continue to increase capital and keep up the value of capital, which is proved by the interest of money continuing the same, the interest to be paid for capital would soon exceed the whole produce of labor. Capital tends in more than arithmetical progression to increase capital. It is admitted that the interest paid to the capitalists, whether in the nature of rents, interests of money, or profits of trade, is paid out of the labor of others. If then capital go on accumulating, the labor to be given for the use of capital must go on increasing. Interest paid for capital continuing the same till all the labor of all the laborers of the society is engrossed by the capitalist. That it is impossible to happen, for whatever may be due to the capitalist, he can only receive the surplus labor of the laborer, for the laborer must live. But it is not clear to him how the value of capital decreases. He himself says, when dealing with Ricardo, that this recurs because wages rise when capital accumulates more rapidly than the population grows, or because the value of wages, not the quantity, increases when the population grows more rapidly than capital accumulates, or even if the population increases simultaneously as a result of decreasing productivity of agriculture. But how does he explain it? He does not accept the latter alternative. He assumes that wages are reduced more and more to the minimum possible. A reduction of interest on capital can only take place, he says, because the portion of capital which is exchanged for living labor declines relatively, although the worker is exploited more than or just as much as before. In any case, it is a step forward that the nonsense about the geometrical progression of interest is reduced to its true sense, that is, nonsense. There are, by the way, according to the pamphleteer, two methods which, in spite of the growth of surplus product or surplus labor, prevent capital from being forced to give a greater share of its plunder back to the workers. The first is the conversion of surplus product into fixed capital, which prevents the labor fund, or the part of the product consumed by the worker, from necessarily increasing with the accumulation of capital. The second is foreign trade, which enables the capitalist to exchange the surplus product for foreign luxury articles and thus to consume it himself. In this way, even that part of the product which exists as necessaries may quite well increase without the need for it to be returned to the worker in the form of a proportionate increase in wages. It should be noted that the first method, which is only effective for a time and then neutralizes its own effect, at least as regards the fixed capital consisting of machinery, etc., which itself is used in the production of necessaries, implies the transformation of surplus product into capital, whereas the second method implies consumption of an ever-increasing portion of the surplus product by the capitalists, increasing consumption on the part of the capitalists and not the reconversion of surplus product into capital. If the same surplus product were to remain in the form in which it immediately exists, a greater part of it would have to be exchanged with the workers as variable capital. The result would be an increase in wages and a reduction in the amount of absolute or relative surplus value. Here is the real secret of the necessity for increasing consumption by the rich, advocated by Malthus, in order that the part of the product which is exchanged for labor and converted into capital should have great value, yield large profits, absorb a large amount of surplus labor. He does not, however, propose that the industrial capitalists themselves should increase their consumption, but allots this function to landlords, sinecures, etc., because the urge for accumulation and the urge for expenditure, if united in the same person, would play tricks on each other. It is here also that the erroneousness of the view of Barton, Ricardo, and others stands out. Wages are not determined by that portion of the total product that is either consumed as or can be converted into variable capital, but by that part of it which is actually converted into variable capital. A part can be consumed by retainers, even in its natural form. Another can be consumed in the shape of luxury products by means of foreign trade, etc. Our pamphleteer overlooks two things. As a result of the introduction of machinery, a mass of workers is constantly being thrown out of employment. A section of the population is thus made redundant. The surplus product, therefore, finds fresh labor for which it can be exchanged without any increase in population, and without any need to extend the absolute working time. Let us assume that 500 workers were employed previously, whereas now there are 300 workers who perform relatively more surplus labor. The other 200 can be employed by the surplus product as soon as it is increased sufficiently. One portion of the old variable capital is converted into fixed capital. The other gives employment to fewer workers, but extracts from them more surplus value in relation to their number, and in particular also more surplus product. The remaining 200 are material created for the purpose of capitalizing additional surplus product. The transformation of necessaries into luxuries by means of foreign trade, as interpreted in the pamphlet, is important in itself, firstly, because it puts an end to the nonsensical idea that wages depend on the amount of necessaries produced, as if these necessaries had to be consumed in this form by the producers, or even by the whole body of people engaged in production. In other words, that they must be transformed again into variable capital, or circulating capital, as it is termed by Barton and Ricardo. Secondly, because it determines the whole social pattern of backward nations. For example, the slave-holding states in the United States of North America, see Cairns, or Poland, etc., as was already understood by Old Bush, unless he stole the idea from Stuart, which are associated with the world market based on capitalist production. No matter how large the surplus product they extract from the surplus labor of their slaves in the simple form of cotton or corn, they can adhere to this simple, undifferentiated labor because foreign trade enables them to convert these simple products into any kind of use value. The assertion that the portion of the annual product which must be expended as wages depends on the size of the circulating capital is equal to the assertion that when a large part of the product consists of buildings, houses for workers are built in large numbers relative to the size of the working population, and that consequently the workers must live in cheap and well-built houses because the supply of houses increases more quickly than the demand for them. It is correct, on the other hand, that if the surplus product is large, and the greater part of it is to be employed as capital, then there must be an increase in the demand for labor, and therefore also in that part of the surplus product which is exchanged for wages, provided large number of workers did not have to be thrown out of work in order to obtain a surplus product of this size. At all events, it is not the absolute size of the surplus product, in whatever form it may exist, even that of necessaries, which necessarily requires it to be expended as variable capital, and which consequently causes an increase in wages, but it is the desire to capitalize, which results in a large part of the surplus product being laid out in variable capital, and this would consequently make wages grow with the accumulation of capital if machinery did not constantly make a section of the population redundant, and if an ever greater portion of capital, in particular as a result of foreign trade, were not exchanged for capital, not for labor. The portion of surplus product which is already produced directly in a form in which it can only serve as capital, and that portion of it which acquires this form as a result of foreign trade, grows more rapidly than the portion which must be exchanged against immediate labor. The proposition that wages depend on existing capital, and that therefore a rapid accumulation of capital is the sole means by which wages are made to rise, amounts to this. On the one hand, to a tautology if we disregard the form in which the conditions of labor exist as capital. How rapidly the number of workers can be increased without worsening their living conditions depends on the productivity of labor which a given number of workers perform. The more raw materials, tools, and means of subsistence they produce, the greater the means at their disposal not only to bring up their children, so long as these cannot work themselves, but to realize the labor of the new growing generation, and consequently to make the growth of production keep up with, and even outdo, the growth of population. Since with the growth of the population, the workers' skill increases, division of labor grows, the possibility for using machinery grows, constant capital grows. In short, the productivity of labor grows. While the growth of population depends on the productivity of labor depends on the growth of the population. It is a case of reciprocity. But this, expressed in capitalist terms, signifies that the means of subsistence of the working population depend on the productivity of capital, on the largest possible portion of their product confronting them as a force which commands their labor. Ricardo himself expresses the matter, correctly, the tautology, when he makes wages depend on the productivity of capital, and the latter dependent on the productivity of labor. That labor depends on the growth of capital signifies nothing more than, on the one hand, the tautology that the increase in the means of subsistence and the means of employment of the population depends on the productivity of the population's own labor, and secondly, expressed in capitalist terms, that it depends on the fact that the population's own product confronts them as alien property, and that as a consequence their own productivity confronts them as the productivity of the things which they create. In practice, this means that the worker must appropriate the smallest possible part of his product in order that the largest possible part of it may confront him as capital. He must surrender as much as possible to the capitalist gratis in order that the latter's means for purchasing his labor, with what has been taken away from the worker without compensation, may increase as much as possible. In this case, it can happen that if the capitalist has made the worker work a great deal for nothing, he may then, in exchange for what he has received for nothing, allow the worker to do a little less work for nothing. However, since this prevents the achievement of what is aimed at, namely accumulation of capital as rapidly as possible, the worker must live in such circumstances that this reduction in the amount of labor he performs for nothing is in turn counteracted by a growth of the working population, either relatively as a result of the use of machinery or absolutely as a result of early marriage. It is the same relationship which is derided by the Ricardians when the Malthusians preach it between landlords and capitalists. The workers must relinquish the largest possible part of their product to the capitalist without receiving anything in return, so as, when conditions are more favorable, to buy back with new labor a part of the product so relinquished. However, since the conditions for the favorable change are at the same time counteracted by this favorable change, it can only be temporary and must turn again into its own opposite. Thirdly, what applies to the transformation of necessaries into luxuries by means of foreign trade applies in general to luxury production, whose unlimited diversification and expansion depends, however, on foreign trade. Although the workers engaged in luxury production produce capital for their employers, their product, in the form in which it exists, cannot be transformed into capital, either constant or variable capital. Luxury products, apart from those which are sent abroad to be exchanged for necessaries, which enter into variable capital, either in whole or in part, simply constitute surplus labor, and moreover, surplus labor which is immediately in the shape of surplus products which the rich consume as revenue. But they do not represent only the surplus labor of the workers who produce them. On the average, these perform the same surplus labor as the workers in other branches of industry, but in the same way as 1/3 of the product, which contains 1/3 of the surplus labor, can be considered as the embodiment of this surplus labor, and the remaining 2/3 as reproduction of the capital advanced, so the surplus labor of the producers of those necessaries which constitute the wages of the producers of luxuries can also be considered as the necessary labor of the working class as a whole. Their surplus labor consists firstly of that part of the necessaries which is consumed by the capitalists and their retainers, and secondly of the total amount of luxuries. With regard to the individual capitalist, or a particular branch of industry, the matter appears quite different. For the capitalist, one part of the luxuries created by him represents merely an equivalent for the capital laid out. If too large a part of surplus labor is embodied directly in luxuries, then clearly accumulation and the rate of reproduction will stagnate, because too small a part of it is reconverted into capital. If too small a part of surplus labor is embodied in luxuries, then the accumulation of capital, that is, on the part of the surplus product which can in kind serve as capital again, will proceed more rapidly than increase in population, and the rate of profit will fall unless a foreign market for necessaries exists. Subsection B. On the exchange between capital and revenue in the case of simple reproduction and of the accumulation of capital. In the exchange between capital and revenue, I have regarded wages too as revenue and have merely examined the relationship of constant capital to revenue. The fact that the revenue of the worker is at the same time variable capital is important only insofar as in the accumulation of capital, the formation of new capital, the surplus consisting of means of subsistence, that is necessaries, in the possession of the capitalist producing them, can be exchanged directly for the surplus consisting of raw materials or machinery in the possession of the capitalist producing constant capital. Here, one form of revenue is exchanged for the other, and once the exchange is effected, the revenue of A is converted into the constant capital of B, and the revenue of B into the variable capital of A. In considering this circulation, reproduction, and manner of replacement of the different capitals, etc., one must first of all disregard foreign trade. Secondly, it is necessary to distinguish between the two aspects of this phenomenon. 1. Reproduction on the existing scale, and 2. Reproduction on an extended scale, or accumulation, transformation of revenue into capital. With regard to 1, I have shown that what the producers of necessaries have to replace is firstly their constant capital, secondly their variable capital. The part of their product in excess of these two constitutes the surplus product, the material existence of surplus value, which in its turn only represents surplus labor. Variable capital, that part of their product which represents it, is made up of wages, the revenue of the workers. This part already exists here in the natural form in which it serves as variable capital once again. With this part, the equivalent reproduced by the worker, the labor of the worker is bought once again. This is the exchange of capital for immediate labor. The worker receives this part in the form of money with which he buys back his own product, or other products of the same category. This is the exchange of the different portions of the variable part of capital for one another, after the worker has in the form of money received an assignment to his quota. This is exchange of one part of newly added labor for another part within the same category, necessaries. The part of the surplus product, newly added labor, consumed by the capitalists, who produce necessaries themselves, is either consumed by them in kind, or they exchange one type of surplus product, existing in consumable form, against another type. This is exchange of revenue for revenue, both of them consisting of newly added labor. We cannot really speak of exchange between revenue and capital in the above transaction. capital, necessaries, is exchanged against labor, labor power. This is therefore not an exchange of revenue for capital. It is true that as soon as the worker receives his wages, he consumes them, but what he exchanges for capital is not his revenue but his labor. The third part of the product of the producers of necessaries, which constitutes constant capital, is exchanged for a part of the product of those manufacturers who produce constant capital, namely for that part which represents newly added labor. This consists of an equivalent for the wages, that is, of variable capital, and of the surplus product, the surplus value, the revenue of the capitalist, which exists in a form in which it can only be consumed industrially and not individually. On the one hand, this is therefore exchange of the variable capital of those producers for a part of the necessaries which constitute the constant capital of the producers of necessaries. In fact, they exchange a part of their product which constitutes variable capital, but exists in the form of constant capital, for a part of the product of those manufacturers who produce necessaries, a part which constitutes constant capital, but exists in the form of variable capital. Here, newly added labor is exchanged for constant capital. On the other hand, that part of the product which represents surplus product, but exists in the form of constant capital, is exchanged for a portion of necessaries which represents constant capital for its producers. Here, revenue is exchanged for capital. The revenue of the capitalists who produce constant capital is exchanged for necessaries and replaces the constant capital of the capitalists who produce necessaries. Finally, a part of the product of the capitalists who produce constant capital, namely that part which itself represents constant capital, is replaced partly in kind, partly through barter, concealed by money, between the producers of constant capital. It is assumed in all this that the scale of reproduction is the same as the original scale of production. If we inquire what part of the total annual product is made up of newly added labor, then the calculation is quite simple. A. Consumable articles for individual consumption. These consist of three parts. Firstly, the revenue of the capitalist, which equals the surplus labor added during the year. Secondly, wages, i.e. variable capital, which is equal to the newly added labor by which the workers have reproduced their wages. Finally, the third part, raw materials, machinery, etc. This is constant capital, that part of the value of the product which is only retained, not produced. That is, it is not labor newly added during the course of the year. If we call constant capital in this category C prime, variable capital V prime, and surplus product, the revenue, R prime, then this category consists of C prime and V prime plus R prime. C prime, which constitutes a part of the product, is merely retained value and does not consist of newly added labor. On the other hand, V prime plus R prime consists of labor newly added during the course of the year. The total product of this category A, or its value, P sub A, after deduction of C prime, therefore, consists of newly added labor. Thus, the product of category A, namely P sub A minus C prime, is equal to the labor newly added during the course of the year. B. Articles for industrial consumption. Here also, V prime prime plus R prime prime are made up of newly added labor, but not C prime prime, the constant capital which operates in this sphere. But V prime prime plus R prime prime equals C prime, for which they are exchanged. C prime is transformed into variable capital and revenue for B. On the other hand, V prime prime and R prime prime are transformed into C prime, into constant capital for A. The product of category B is P sub B. P sub B minus C prime prime is equal to the labor newly added during the course of the year. But P sub B minus C prime prime is equal to C prime, for the whole product of P sub B after deduction of C prime prime, the constant capital employed in this category, is exchanged for C prime. After V prime prime plus R prime prime have been exchanged for C prime, the matter can be presented as follows. P sub A consists solely of newly added labor, the product of which is divided between profits and wages. That is, it constitutes the equivalent of necessary labor and the equivalent of surplus labor. For the V prime prime plus R prime prime, which now replace C prime, are equal to the newly added labor in category B. Thus, the whole product of P sub A, not only its surplus product but also its variable capital and its constant capital, consists of the products of labor newly added during the course of the year. On the other hand, P sub B can be regarded in such a way that it does not represent any part of the newly added labor, but merely old labor which is retained. For its part, C prime prime does not represent newly added labor. Neither does the part C prime which it has received in exchange for V prime prime plus R prime prime. For this, C prime represents the constant capital laid out in A and not newly added labor. The whole part of the annual product, which as variable capital constitutes the revenue of the workers and as surplus product constitutes the consumption fund of the capitalist, therefore consists of newly added labor, whereas the remaining part of the product, which represents constant capital, consists merely of old labor which has been retained and simply replaces constant capital. Consequently, just as it is correct to say that the whole portion of the annual product which is consumed as revenue, wages and profits, together with the branches of profit, rent, interest, etc., as well as the wages of the unproductive laborers, consists of newly added labor, so it is false to assert that the total annual product resolves itself into revenue, wages, and profits, and thus merely into portions of newly added labor. A part of the annual product resolves itself into constant capital, which, regarded as value, does not comprise newly added labor, and as regards use, does not form part of either wages or profits. Its value represents accumulated labor in the real sense of the word, and its use value the utilization of this accumulated past labor. On the other hand, it is equally correct that the labor added during the year is not represented entirely by that part of the product which constitutes wages and profits, for these wages and profits also buy services, that is, labor which does not enter into the product of which wages and profits form a part. These services are labor which is used up in the consumption of the product and does not enter into its immediate production. With regard to case number 2, it is a different matter with regard to accumulation, transformation of revenue into capital, reproduction on an extended scale, insofar as this latter does not simply result from more productive employment of the old capital. Here, the whole new capital consists of newly added labor, that is, of surplus labor in the form of profit, etc. But although it is correct that here the entire element in new production arises from and consists of newly added labor, which is a part of the surplus labor of the laborers, it is wrong to assume, as the economists do, that when it is converted into capital, it constitutes only variable capital, that is, wages. Let us suppose, for example, that a part of the surplus product of the farmer is exchanged for a part of the surplus product of the machine manufacturer. It is then possible that the latter will convert the corn into variable capital and employ more workers, directly or indirectly. On the other hand, the farmer has converted a part of his surplus product into constant capital, and it is possible that as a result of this conversion, he will discharge some of his old workers instead of taking on new ones. The farmer may cultivate more land. In this case, a part of his corn will be converted not into wages, but into constant capital, etc. It is precisely accumulation which reveals clearly that everything, i.e. revenue, variable capital, and constant capital, is nothing but appropriated alien labor, and that both the means of labor with which the worker works and the equivalent he receives for his labor consist of labor performed by the worker and appropriated by the capitalist, who has not given any equivalent for it. The same applies even to original accumulation. Let us assume that I have saved £500 from my wages. In fact, therefore, this sum represents not only accumulated labor, but in contrast to the accumulated labor of the capitalist, my own labor, accumulated by me and for me. I convert the £500 into capital, buy raw material, etc., and take on workers. Profit is, say, 20%, that is £100 in a year. In 5 years, I shall have eaten up my capital in the form of revenue, provided new accumulation does not continually take place and the £100 profit is assumed. In the 6th year, my capital of £500 itself consists of other people's labor, appropriated without any equivalent. If, on the other hand, I had always accumulated half of the profit made, the process of eating up my original capital would have been slower, for I would not have consumed so much, and the process of appropriating other people's labor more rapid. The following table will not be read aloud for the recording. Please consult Section 1, Subsection B of Chapter 21 of a physical or digital copy of the book for visual reference. My capital will have almost doubled in 8 years, although I have consumed more than my original capital. The capital of £972 does not contain a single farthing of paid labor or of labor for which I have returned any kind of equivalent. I have consumed my entire original capital in the form of revenue. That is, I have received an equivalent for it which I have consumed. The new capital consists solely of the appropriated labor of other people. In considering surplus value as such, the original form of the product, hence of the surplus product, is of no consequence. It becomes important when considering the actual process of reproduction, partly in order to understand its forms, and partly in order to grasp the influence of luxury production, etc., on reproduction. Here is another example of how use value as such acquires economic significance. Subsection C. The merits of the author of the pamphlet and the theoretical confusion of his views. The importance of the questions he raises about the role of foreign trade in capitalist society and of free time as real wealth. Now to return to our pamphlet. Suppose the whole labor of the country to raise just sufficient for the support of the whole population. It is evident there is no surplus labor. Consequently, nothing that can be allowed to accumulate as capital. Suppose the whole labor of the country to raise as much in 1 year as would maintain it in 2 years. It is evident 1 year's consumption must perish, or for 1 year, men must cease from productive labor. But the possessors of the surplus produce or capital will neither maintain the population the following year in idleness, nor allow the produce to perish. They will employ them upon something not directly and immediately productive, for instance, in the erection of machinery, etc., etc., etc. But the third year, the whole population may again return to productive labor, and the machinery erected in the last year coming now into operation, it is evident the produce will be greater than the first year's produce, and the produce of the machinery in addition. This surplus labor must perish, or be put to use as before, and this usage again adds to the productive power of the society till men must cease from productive labor for a time, or the produce of their labor must perish. This is the palpable consequence in the simplest state of society. The demand of other countries is limited not only by our power to produce, but by their power to produce. This is the answer to Say's assertion that we do not produce too much, but they produce too little. Their power to produce is not necessarily equal to our power to produce. For do what you will, in a series of years, the whole world can take little more of us than we take of the world, so that all your foreign trade, of which there is so much talking, never did, never could, nor ever can add 1 shilling to the wealth of the country. As for every bale of silk, chest of tea, pipe of wine that was ever imported, something of equal value was exported, and even the profits made by our merchants in their foreign trade are paid by the consumer of the return goods here. Foreign trade is mere barter and exchange for the convenience and enjoyment of the capitalist. He has not 100 bodies, nor 100 legs. He cannot consume in cloth and cotton stockings all the cloth and cotton stockings that are manufactured. Therefore, they are exchanged for wines and silks, but those wines and silks represent the surplus labor of our own population, as much as the cloths and cottons, and in this way, the destructive power of the capitalist is increased beyond all bounds. By foreign trade, the capitalists contrive to outwit nature, who had put 1,000 natural limits to their exactions, and to their wishes to exact. There is no limit now, either to their power or desires. One sees that he accepts Ricardo's teaching on foreign trade. In Ricardo's work, its only purpose is to support his theory of value, or to demonstrate that his views on foreign trade are not at variance with it. But the pamphlet stresses that it is not only national labor, but also national surplus labor, which is embodied in the outcome of foreign trade. If surplus labor or surplus value were represented only in the national surplus product, then the increase of value for the sake of value, and therefore the exaction of surplus labor, would be restricted by the limited, narrow circle of use values in which the value of the national labor would be represented. But it is foreign trade which develops the surplus product's real nature as value by developing the labor embodied in it as social labor, which manifests itself in an unlimited range of different use values, and this in fact gives meaning to abstract wealth. It is the infinite variety of wants and of the kinds of commodities, and therefore also the infinite variety of real labor which produces those different kinds of commodities, necessary to their gratification, which alone renders the passion for wealth indefinite and insatiable, and hence the passion for appropriating other people's labor. End quote from Wakefield's edition of Adam Smith, An Inquiry into the Nature and Source of the Wealth of Nations, Volume 1, published in London in 1835. But it is only foreign trade, the development of the market to a world market, which causes money to develop into world money, and abstract labor into social labor. Abstract wealth, value, money, hence abstract labor, develop in the measure that concrete labor becomes a totality of different modes of labor embracing the world's market. Capitalist production rests on the value or the transformation of the labor embodied in the product into social labor. But this is only possible on the basis of foreign trade and of the world market. This is at once the precondition and the result of capitalist production. The pamphlet is no theoretical treatise. It is a protest against the false reasons given by the economists for the distress and the national difficulties of the times. It does not consequently make the claim that its conception of surplus value as surplus labor carries with it a general criticism of the entire system of economic categories, nor can this be expected of it. The author stands rather on Ricardian ground, and is only consistent in stating one of the consequences inherent in the system itself, and he advances it in the interests of the working class against capital. For the rest, the author remains a captive of the economic categories as he finds them. Just as in the case of Ricardo, the confusion of surplus value with profit leads to undesirable contradictions, so in his case, the fact that he christens surplus value the interest of capital. To be sure, he is in advance of Ricardo in that he first of all reduces all surplus value to surplus labor, and when he calls surplus value interest of capital, he at the same time emphasizes that by this he understands the general form of surplus labor, in contrast to its special forms, rent, interest of money, and industrial profit. Interests paid to the capitalists, whether in the nature, it should be shape or form, of rents, interests of money, or profits of trade. He thus distinguishes the general form of surplus labor, or surplus value, from their particular forms, something which neither Ricardo nor Adam Smith does, at least not consciously or consistently. But on the other hand, he applies the name of one of these particular forms, interest, to the general form. And this suffices to make him relapse into economic slang. The progress of increasing capital would, in established societies, be marked by the decreasing interest of money, or, which is the same thing, the decreasing quantity of the labor of others that would be given for its use. This passage reminds one of Carey. But with him, it is not the laborer who uses capital, but capital which uses the laborers. Since by interest he understands surplus labor in any form, the matter of the remedy of our national difficulties amounts to an increase in wages, for the reduction of interest means a reduction of surplus labor. However, what he really means is that in the exchange of capital for labor, the appropriation of alien labor should be reduced, or that the worker should appropriate more of his own labor and capital less. Reduction of surplus labor can mean two things. Less work should be performed over and above the time which is necessary to reproduce the labor power, that is, to create an equivalent for wages, or less of the total quantity of labor should assume the form of surplus labor, that is, the form of time worked gratis for the capitalist. Therefore, less of the product in which labor manifests itself should take the form of surplus product. In other words, the worker should receive more of his own product and less of it should go to the capitalist. The author is not quite clear about this himself, as can be seen from the following passage, which is really the last word in this matter as far as the pamphlet is concerned. He says, "A nation is really rich only if no interest is paid for the use of capital, when only 6 hours instead of 12 hours are worked. Wealth is disposable time and nothing more." Since what is understood by interest here is profit, rent, and interest, in short, all the forms of surplus value, and since, according to the author himself, capital is nothing but the produce of labor, i.e. accumulated labor which is able to extract in exchange for itself not only an equal quantity of labor but surplus labor, according to him, the phrase "capital bears no interest" therefore means that capital does not exist. The product is not transformed into capital. No surplus product and no surplus labor exist. Only then is a nation really rich. This can mean, however, there is no product and no labor over and above the product and the labor required for the reproduction of the workers. Or the workers themselves appropriate this surplus either of the product or of the labor. That the author does not simply mean the latter is, however, clear from the fact that the words "no interest is paid for the use of capital" are juxtaposed to the proposition that a nation is really rich when only 6 hours, not 12 hours, are worked. Quote, "Wealth is disposable time and nothing more," end quote. This can now mean, if everybody has to work, if the contradiction between those who have to work too much and those who are idlers disappears, and this would in any case be the result of capital ceasing to exist, of the product ceasing to provide a title to alien surplus labor, and if in addition the development of the productive forces brought about by capitalism is taken into account, society will produce the necessary abundance in 6 hours, producing more than it does now in 12. And moreover, all will have 6 hours of disposable time, that is, real wealth. Time which will not be absorbed in direct productive labor, but will be available for enjoyment, for leisure, thus giving scope for free activity and development. Time is scope for the development of man's faculties, etc. The economists themselves justify the slave labor of the wage laborers by saying that it creates leisure, free time for others, for another section of society, and thereby also for the society of wage laborers. Or it can also mean the workers now work 6 hours more than the time now required for their own reproduction. This can hardly be the author's view, since he describes what they use now as an inhuman minimum. If capital ceases to exist, then the workers will work for 6 hours only, and the idlers will have to work for the same amount of time. The material wealth of all would thus be depressed to the level of the workers, but all would have disposable time, that is, free time for their development. The author himself is obviously not clear about this. Nevertheless, there remains the fine statement, "A nation is really rich when 6 hours instead of 12 hours are worked. Wealth is disposable time and nothing more." Ricardo himself, in the chapter entitled "Value and Riches, Their Distinctive Properties," also says that real wealth consists in producing the greatest possible amount of values in use having the least possible exchange value. This means, in other words, that the greatest possible abundance of material wealth is created in the shortest possible labor time. Here also the disposable time and the enjoyment of that which is produced in the labor time of others appear as the real wealth. But like everything in capitalist production, and consequently in its interpreters, it appears in the form of a contradiction. In Ricardo's work, the contradiction between riches and value later appears in the form that the net product should be as large as possible in relation to the gross product, which again, in this contradictory form, amounts to saying that those classes in society whose time is only partly or not at all absorbed in material production, although they enjoy its fruits, should be as numerous as possible in comparison with those classes whose time is totally absorbed in material production, and whose consumption is, as a consequence, a mere item in production costs, a mere condition for their existence as beasts of burden. There is always the wish that the smallest possible portion of society should be doomed to the slavery of labor, to forced labor. This is the utmost that can be accomplished from the capitalist standpoint. The author puts an end to this. Labor time, even if exchange value is eliminated, always remains the creative substance of wealth and the measure of the cost of its production. But free time, disposable time, is wealth itself, partly for the enjoyment of the product, partly for free activity, which, unlike labor, is not dominated by the pressure of an extraneous purpose which must be fulfilled, and the fulfillment of which is regarded as a natural necessity or a social duty, according to one's inclination. It is self-evident that if labor time is reduced to a normal length, and furthermore labor is no longer performed for someone else but for myself, and at the same time the social contradictions between master and men, etc., being abolished, it acquires a quite different, a free character. It becomes real social labor. And finally, the basis of disposable time, the labor of a man who has also disposable time, must be of a much higher quality than that of the beasts of burden. Section 2. Ravenstone. The view of capital as the surplus product of the worker. Confusion of the antagonistic form of capitalist development with its content. This leads to a negative attitude towards the results of the capitalist development of the productive forces. Piercy Ravenstone, M.A. Thoughts on the Funding System and Its Effects, published in London in 1824. A most remarkable work. The author of The Source and Remedy of the National Difficulties, discussed above, understands surplus value in its original form, i.e. that of surplus labor. Consequently, his attention is mainly centered on the extent of labor time. In particular, the conception of surplus labor or surplus value in its absolute form, the extension of labor time beyond that required for the reproduction of the laborer himself, not the reduction of necessary labor as a result of the development of the productive power of labor. The reduction of this necessary labor is the principal aspect examined by Ricardo, but in the way it is carried out in capitalist production, namely as a means for extending the amount of labor time accruing to capital. This pamphlet, on the contrary, declares that the final aim is the reduction of the producer's labor time and the cessation of labor for the possessor of surplus product. Ravenstone seems to assume the working day as given. Hence, what he is particularly interested in, just as was also the author of the pamphlet previously discussed, so that the theoretical questions only crop up incidentally, is relative surplus value, or the surplus product which accrues to capital as a result of the development of the productive power of labor. As is usual with those who adopt this standpoint, surplus labor is conceived here more in the form of surplus product, whereas in the previous pamphlet, surplus product is conceived more in the form of surplus labor. To teach that the wealth and power of a nation depend on its capital is to make industry ancillary to riches, to make men subservient to property. The opposition evoked by the Ricardian theory on the basis of its own assumptions has the following characteristic feature. To the same extent as political economy developed, and this development finds its most trenchant expression in Ricardo, as far as fundamental principles are concerned, it presented labor as the sole element of value and the only creator of use values, and the development of the productive forces as the only real means for increasing wealth. The greatest possible development of the productive power of labor as the economic basis of society. This is, in fact, the foundation of capitalist production. Ricardo's work in particular, which demonstrates that the law of value is not invalidated either by landed property or by capitalist accumulation, etc., is, in reality, only concerned with eliminating all contradictions or phenomena which appear to run counter to this conception. But in the same measure as it is understood that labor is the sole source of exchange value and the active source of use value, capital is likewise conceived by the same economists, in particular by Ricardo and even more by Terens, Malthus, Bailey, and others after him, as the regulator of production, the source of wealth and the aim of production, whereas labor is regarded as wage labor, whose representative and real instrument is inevitably a pauper, to which Malthus's theory of population contributed, a mere production cost, an instrument of production dependent on a minimum wage and forced to drop even below this minimum as soon as the existing quantity of labor is superfluous for capital. In this contradiction, political economy merely expressed the essence of capitalist production, or, if you like, of wage labor, of labor alienated from itself, which stands confronted by the wealth it has created as alien wealth, by its own productive power as the productive power of its product, by its enrichment as its own impoverishment, and by its social labor as the power of society. But this definite, specific, historical form of social labor, which is exemplified in capitalist production, is proclaimed by these economists as the general, eternal form, as a natural phenomenon, and these relations of production as the absolutely, not historically, necessary, natural, and reasonable relations of social labor. Their thoughts being entirely confined within the bounds of capitalist production, they assert that the contradictory form in which social labor manifests itself there is just as necessary as labor itself freed from this contradiction. Since, in the selfsame breath, they proclaim on the one hand labor as such, for them labor is synonymous with wage labor, and on the other capital as such, that is, the poverty of the workers and the wealth of the idlers, to be the sole source of wealth, they are perpetually involved in absolute contradictions without being in the slightest degree aware of them. Sismondi was epoch-making in political economy because he had an inkling of this contradiction. Ricardo's phrase, labor or capital, reveals in a most striking fashion both the contradiction inherent in the terms and the naivete with which they are stated to be identical. Since the same real development which provided bourgeois political economy with this striking theoretical expression unfolded the real contradictions contained in it, especially the contradictions between the growing wealth of the English nation and the growing misery of the workers, and since, moreover, these contradictions are given a theoretically compelling, if unconscious, expression in the Ricardian theory, etc., it was natural for those thinkers who rallied to the side of the proletariat to seize on this contradiction, for which they found the theoretical ground already prepared. Labor is the sole source of exchange value, and the only active creator of use value. This is what you say. On the other hand, you say that capital is everything, and the worker is nothing or a mere production cost of capital. You have refuted yourselves. Capital is nothing but defrauding of the worker. Labor is everything. This, in fact, is the ultimate meaning of all the writings which defend the interests of the proletariat from the Ricardian standpoint, basing themselves on his assumptions. Just as little as Ricardo understands the identity of capital and labor in his own system, do they understand the contradiction they describe. That is why the most important among them, Hodgkin, for example, accept all the economic preconditions of capitalist production as eternal forms, and only desire to eliminate capital, which is both the basis and necessary consequence of these preconditions. Ravenstone's main idea is as follows. The development of the productive power of labor creates capital or property, in other words, a surplus product for idlers, non-workers, and indeed, the more the productive power of labor develops, the more it produces this, its parasitical excrescence, which sucks it dry. Whether the title to this surplus product or the power to appropriate the product of other people's labor accrues to the non-worker because he already possesses wealth, or because he possesses landed property, does not affect the case. Both are capital, that is, mastery over the product of other people's labor. For Ravenstone, property is merely appropriation of the products of other people's labor, and this is only possible insofar as and in the degree that productive industry develops. By productive industry, Ravenstone understands industry which produces necessaries. Unproductive industry, the industry of consumption, is a consequence of the development of capital or property. Ravenstone appears ascetic, like the author of the pamphlet discussed above. In this respect, he himself remains a captive of the notions set forth by the economists. Without capital, without property, the necessaries of the workers would be produced in abundance, but there would be no luxury industry. Or it can be said that Ravenstone, like the author of the pamphlet discussed above, understands, or at least in fact admits, the historical necessity of capital, since capital, according to the author of the pamphlet, produces surplus labor over and above the labor strictly necessary for the maintenance of the worker, and at the same time leads to the creation of machinery, what he calls fixed capital, and gives rise to foreign trade, the world market, in order to utilize the surplus product filched from the workers, partly to increase productive power, partly to give this surplus product the most diverse forms of use value, far removed from those required by necessity. Similarly, according to Ravenstone, no conveniences, no machinery, no luxury products would be produced without capital and property. Neither would the development of the natural sciences have taken place, nor the literary and artistic productions which owe their existence to leisure, nor the urge of the wealthy to receive an equivalent for their surplus product from the non-workers. Ravenstone and the pamphleteer do not say this in justification of capital, but simply seize on it as a point of attack, because all this is done in opposition to the interests of the workers and not for them. But in fact, they thus admit that this is a result of capitalist production, which is therefore a historical form of social development, even though it stands in contradiction to the part of the population which constitutes the basis of that whole development. In this respect, they share the narrow-mindedness of the economists, although from a diametrically opposite position, for they confuse the contradictory form of this development with its content. The latter wish to perpetuate the contradiction on account of its results. The former are determined to sacrifice the fruits which have developed within the antagonistic form in order to get rid of the contradiction. This distinguishes their opposition to bourgeois political economy from that of contemporary people like Owen, likewise from that of Sismondi, who harks back to antiquated forms of the contradiction in order to be rid of it in its acute form. Ravenstone writes, "It is the wants of the poor which constitute the rich man's wealth. When all were equal, none would labor for another. The necessaries of life would be overabundant, whilst its comforts would be entirely wanting. The industry which produces is the parent of property. That which aids consumption is its child. It is this growth of property, this greater ability to maintain idle men and unproductive industry, that in political economy is called capital. As the destination of property is expense, as without that it is wholly useless to its owner, its existence is intimately connected with that of the industry of consumption. If each man's labor were but enough to procure his own food, there could be no property, and no part of a people's industry could be turned away to work for the wants of the imagination. In every subsequent stage of society, as increased numbers and better contrivances add to each man's power of production, the number of those who labor is gradually diminished. Property grows from the improvement of the means of production. Its sole business is the encouragement of idleness. When each man's labor is barely sufficient for his own subsistence, as there can be no property, there will be no idle man. When one man's labor can maintain 5, there will be 4 idle men, for one employed in production. In no other way can the produce be consumed. The object of society is to magnify the idle at the expense of the industrious, to create power out of plenty." With regard to rent, he says what applies to surplus value in general, insofar as it develops as a result of the increase in the productivity of labor. Not quite correctly, for it is precisely here that it is necessary to explain why rent accrues to the landlord and not to the farmer, the industrial capitalist. In the early stages of society, when men have no artificial assistance to their powers of industry, the proportion of their earnings which can be afforded to rent is exceedingly small. For land has no natural value. It owes all its produce to industry. But every increase of skill adds to the proportion which can be reserved for rent. Where the labor of 9 is required for the maintenance of 10, only 1/10 of the gross produce can be given to rent. Where one man's labor is sufficient for the maintenance of 5, 4/5 will go to rent, or the other charges of the state, which can only be provided for out of the surplus produce of industry. The first proportion seems to have prevailed in England at the time of the conquest. The last is that which actually takes place now, since only 1/5 part of the people are employed in the cultivation of the land. So true it is that society turns every improvement but to the increase of idleness. Amongst other things, he says, "The history of the last 30 years has achieved no higher adventure than the turning of a few Jews into gentlemen and a few blockheads into political economists. The funding system," he says, "has one beneficial consequence, although the ancient gentry of the land are robbed of a large portion of their property in order to transfer it to these newfangled hidalgos as a reward for their skill in the arts of fraud and peculation. If it encourage fraud and meanness, if it clothe quackery and pretension in the garb of wisdom, if it turn a whole people into a nation of jobbers, if it break down all the prejudices of rank and birth to render money the only distinction among men, it destroys the perpetuity of property." Section 3. Hodgkin. Labor defended against the claims of capital, or the unproductiveness of capital proved by a laborer, published in London, 1825, with reference to the present combinations amongst journeymen. Thomas Hodgkin, Popular Political Economy, 4 lectures delivered at the London Mechanics' Institution, London, 1827. The anonymous first work is also by Hodgkin. Whereas the pamphlets mentioned previously, and a series of similar ones, have disappeared without a trace, these writings, especially the first one, made a considerable stir and are still regarded as belonging to the most important works of English political economy. See John Laylor, Money and Morals, London, 1852. We shall consider each of these works in turn. Subsection A. the thesis of the unproductiveness of capital as a necessary conclusion from Ricardo's theory. Labor defended, etc. As the title indicates, the author wishes to prove the unproductiveness of capital. Ricardo does not assert that capital is productive of value. It only adds its own value to the product, and its own value depends on the labor time required for its reproduction. It only has value as accumulated labor, or rather, materialized labor, and it only adds this, its value, to the product in which it is embodied. It is true that he is inconsistent when discussing the general rate of profit, but this is precisely the contradiction which his opponents attacked. As far as the productivity of capital in relation to use value is concerned, this is construed by Smith, Ricardo, and others, and by political economists in general, as meaning nothing else than that products of previous useful work serve anew as means of production, as objects of labor, instruments of labor, and means of subsistence for the workers. The objective conditions of labor do not face the worker, as in the primitive stages, as mere natural objects. As such, they are never capital, but as natural objects already transformed by human activity. But in this sense, the word capital is quite superfluous and meaningless. Wheat is nourishing not because it is capital, but because it is wheat. The use value of wool derives from the fact that it is wool, not capital. In the same way, the action of steam-powered machinery has nothing in common with its existence as capital. It would do the same work if it were not capital, and if it belonged not to the factory owner but to the workers. All these things serve in the real labor process because of the relationship which exists between them as use values, not as exchange values and still less as capital, and the labor which sets them in motion. Their productivity in the real labor process, or rather the productivity of the labor materialized in them, is due to their nature as objective conditions of real labor, and not to their social existence as alienated independent conditions, which confront the worker and are embodied in the capitalist, the master over living labor. It is as wealth, as Hopkins, not our Hodgkin, rightly says, and not as net wealth, as product and not as net product, that they are here consumed and used. It is true that the particular social form of these things in relation to labor and their real determinateness as factors of the labor process are as confused and inseparably interwoven with one another in the minds of the economists as they are in the mind of the capitalist. Nevertheless, as soon as they analyze the labor process, they are compelled to abandon the term capital completely and to speak of material of labor, and means of subsistence. But the determinate form of the product as material, instrument, and means of subsistence of the worker expresses nothing but the relationship of these objective conditions to labor. Labor itself appears as the activity which dominates them. It says, however, nothing at all about the relationship of labor and capital, only about the relationship of the purposeful activity of men to their own products in the process of reproduction. They neither cease to be products of labor, nor mere objects which are at the disposal of labor. They merely express the relationship in which labor appropriates the objective world which it has created itself, at any rate in this form. But they do not by any means express any other domination of these things over labor, apart from the fact that activity must be appropriate to the material, otherwise it would not be purposeful activity, labor. One can only speak of the productivity of capital if one regards it as the embodiment of definite social relations of production. But if it is conceived in this way, then the historical transitory character of this relationship becomes at once evident, and the general recognition of this fact is incompatible with the continued existence of this relationship, which itself creates the means for its abolition. But the economists do not regard capital as such a relationship because they cannot admit its relative character and do not understand it either. They simply express in theoretical terms the notions of the practical men who are engrossed in capitalist production, dominated by it and interested in it. In his polemic with the bourgeois economists, Hodgkin himself starts out from a standpoint which is economically narrow-minded. Insofar as the economists define capital as an eternal production relation, they reduce it to the general relations of labor to its material conditions, relations which are common to all modes of production and do not express the specific nature of capital. Insofar as they hold that capital produces value, the best of them, and especially Ricardo, admit that it does not produce any value which it has not received and constantly continues to receive from labor, since the value of a product is determined by the labor time necessary to reproduce it. That is, its value is the result of living present labor and not of past labor. And as Ricardo emphasizes, increase in the productivity of labor is marked by the continuous devaluation of the products of past labor. On the other hand, the economists continually mix up the definite specific form in which these things constitute capital with their nature as things and as simple elements of every labor process. The mystification contained in capital, as employer of labor, is not explained by them, but it is constantly expressed by them unconsciously, for it is inseparable from the material aspect of capital. The first pamphlet draws the correct conclusions from Ricardo and reduces surplus value to surplus labor. This is in contrast to Ricardo's opponents and followers who continued to adhere to his confusion of surplus value with profit. In opposition to them, the second pamphlet defines relative surplus value more exactly as being dependent on the level of development of the productive power of labor. Ricardo says the same thing, but he avoids the conclusion drawn by the second pamphlet, that by Ravenstone, namely that the increase in the productive power of labor only increases capital, the wealth of others which dominates labor. Finally, the third pamphlet bursts forth with the general statement, which is the inevitable consequence of Ricardo's presentation, that capital is unproductive. This is in contrast to Terens, Malthus, and others, who, taking one aspect of the Ricardian theory as their point of departure, turn Ricardo's statement that labor is the creator of value into the opposite, that capital is the creator of value. The pamphlet, moreover, disputes the statement, which recurs in all of them, from Smith to Malthus, especially in the latter where it is elevated into an absolute dogma, ditto in the case of James Mill, that labor is absolutely dependent on the amount of capital available, as this is the condition of its existence. Pamphlet number 1 ends with the statement, "Wealth is disposable time and nothing more." Subsection B. Polemic against the Ricardian definition of capital as accumulated labor. The concept of coexisting labor. Underestimation of the importance of materialized past labor. Available wealth in relation to the movement of production. According to Hodgkin, circulating capital is nothing but the juxtaposition of the different kinds of social labor, coexisting labor, and accumulation is nothing but the amassing of the productive powers of social labor, so that the accumulation of the skill and knowledge, scientific power, of the workers themselves is the chief form of accumulation, and infinitely more important than the accumulation of the existing objective conditions of this accumulated activity. These objective conditions are only nominally accumulated and must be constantly produced anew and consumed anew. Productive capital and skilled labor are one. Capital and a laboring population are precisely synonymous. These are simply further elaborations of Galgani's thesis. The real wealth is man. The whole objective world, the world of commodities, vanishes here as a mere aspect, as the merely passing activity, constantly performed anew, of socially producing men. Compare this idealism with the crude material fetishism into which the Ricardian theory develops in the writings of this incredible cobbler, McCulloch, where not only the difference between man and animal disappears, but even the difference between a living organism and an inanimate object. And then let them say that as against the lofty idealism of bourgeois political economy, the proletarian opposition has been preaching a crude materialism directed exclusively towards the satisfaction of coarse appetites. In his investigations into the productivity of capital, Hodgkin is remiss in that he does not distinguish between how far it is a question of producing use values or exchange values. Further, but this has historical justification, he takes capital as it is defined by the economists. On the one hand, insofar as it operates in the real process of production as a merely physical condition of labor, and therefore of importance only as a material element of labor, and, in the process of the production of value, nothing more than the quantity of labor measured by time, that is, nothing different from this quantity of labor itself. On the other hand, although in fact, insofar as it appears in the real process of production, it is a mere name for and rechristening of labor itself, it is represented as the power dominating and engendering labor, as the basis of the production of labor, and as wealth alien to labor. And this without any intermediate links. This is how he found it, and he counterposes the real aspect of economic development to this bourgeois humbug. Capital is a sort of Kabbalistic word, like church or state, or any other of those general terms which are invented by those who fleece the rest of mankind to conceal the hand that shears them. In accordance with the tradition he found prevailing among the economists, he distinguishes between circulating and fixed capital. Circulating capital, moreover, is described as that part which mainly consists of or is used as means of subsistence for the workers. It is maintained that division of labor is a consequence of previous accumulation of capital, but the effects attributed to a stock of commodities under the name of circulating capital are caused by coexisting labor. Faced with the crude conception of the economists, it is quite correct to say that circulating capital is only the name for a stock of certain commodities. Since the economists have not analyzed the specific social relationship which is represented in the metamorphosis of commodities, they can understand only the material aspect of circulating capital. All the differentiations in capital arising from the circulation process, in fact, the circulation process itself, are actually nothing but the metamorphosis of commodities, determined by their relationship to wage labor as capital, as an aspect of the reproduction process. Division of labor is, in one sense, nothing but coexisting labor, that is, the coexistence of different kinds of labor which are represented in different kinds of products, or rather commodities. The division of labor in the capitalist sense, as the breaking down of the particular labor which produces a definite commodity into a series of simple and coordinated operations divided up amongst different workers, presupposes the division of labor within society outside the workshop, as separation of occupations. On the other hand, it increases the separation of occupations. The product is increasingly produced as a commodity in the strict sense of the word. Its exchange value becomes all the more independent of its immediate existence as use value. In other words, its production becomes more and more independent of its consumption by the producers and of its existence as use value for the producers. The more one-sided it itself becomes, and the greater the variety of commodities for which it is exchanged, the greater the kinds of use values in which its exchange value is expressed, and the larger the market for it becomes. The more this happens, the more the product can be produced as a commodity, therefore also on an increasingly large scale. The producer's indifference to the use value of his product is expressed quantitatively in the amounts in which he produces it, which bear no relation to his own consumption needs, even when he is at the same time a consumer of his own product. The division of labor within the workshop is one of the methods used in this mass production, and consequently in the production of the product as a commodity. Thus, the division of labor within the workshop is based on the division of occupations in society. The size of the market has two aspects. First, the mass of consumers, their numbers. But secondly also, the number of occupations which are independent of one another. The latter is possible without the former. For example, when spinning and weaving become divorced from domestic industry and agriculture, all those engaged in agriculture become a market for spinners and weavers. They likewise form markets for one another as a consequence of the separation of their occupations. What the division of labor in society presupposes, above all, is that the different kinds of labor have become independent of one another in such a way that their products confront one another as commodities and must be exchanged, that is, undergo the metamorphosis of commodities and stand in relation to one another as commodities. This is why in the Middle Ages, the towns prohibited the spread of as many professions as possible to the countryside, not merely for the purpose of preventing competition, the only aspect seen by Adam Smith, but in order to create markets for themselves. On the other hand, the proper development of the division of labor presupposes a certain density of the population. The development of the division of labor in the workshop depends even more on this density of population. This latter division is, to a certain extent, a precondition for the former, and in turn intensifies it still further. It does this by splitting formerly correlated occupations into separate and independent ones, also by differentiating and increasing the indirect preliminary work they require, and as a result of the increase in both production and the population, and the freeing of capital and labor, it creates new wants and new modes of satisfying them. Therefore, when Hodgkin says division of labor is the effect not of a stock of commodities called circulating capital, but of coexisting labor, it would be tautologous if in this context he understood by division of labor the separation of trades. It would only mean that the division of labor is the cause, or the effect, of the division of labor. He can therefore only mean that division of labor within the workshop depends on the separation of occupations, the social division of labor, and is in a certain sense its effect. It is not a stock of commodities which gives rise to this separation of occupations, and with it the division of labor in the workshop, but it is the separation of occupations and division of labor that is manifested in the stock of commodities, or rather, in the fact that a stock of products becomes a stock of commodities. The properties, the characteristic features of the capitalist mode of production, and therefore of capital itself insofar as it expresses a definite relation of the producers to one another and to their products, are inevitably always described by the economists as properties of the objects. If, however, previous accumulation of capital is being discussed from an economic standpoint, see Turgot, Smith, etc., as a condition for the division of labor, then what is understood by this is the previous concentration of a stock of commodities as capital in the possession of the buyer of labor, since the kind of cooperation characteristic of the division of labor presupposes a conglomeration of workers, consequently, accumulation of the means of subsistence necessary for them while they are working, increased productivity of labor, consequently, increase in the amount of raw materials, tools, and auxiliary materials which must be available in order that labor proceeds continuously, since it constantly requires large amounts of these things, in short, of the objective conditions of production on a large scale. Here, accumulation of capital cannot mean increase in the amount of means of subsistence, raw materials, and instruments of labor as a condition for the division of labor, for insofar as the accumulation of capital is taken to mean this, it is a consequence of the division of labor, not its precondition. Similarly, accumulation of capital cannot here mean that means of subsistence for the workers must be available in general before new necessaries are reproduced, or that products of their labor must constitute the raw material and means of labor for the new production which they carry out. For this is the precondition of labor in general, and was just as true before the development of the division of labor as it is after it. On the other hand, if we consider the material element of accumulation, it means nothing more than that the division of labor requires the concentration of means of subsistence and means of labor at particular points, whereas formerly these were scattered and dispersed as long as the workers in individual trades, which could not have been very numerous under these conditions, themselves carried out all the manifold and consecutive operations required for the production of one or more products. Not an increase in absolute terms is presupposed, but concentration, the gathering together of more at a given point, and of relatively more means of labor compared with the number of workers brought together there. More flax, for example, is used by the workers in manufacture in proportion to their numbers than the relative amount of flax required in proportion to all the peasants, both men and women, who used to spin flax as a sideline. Here, conglomeration of workers, concentration of raw materials, instruments, and means of subsistence. On the other hand, if we consider the historical foundation on which this process develops, from which manufacture arises, the industrial mode of production whose characteristic feature is the division of labor, then this concentration can only take place in the form that these workers are assembled together as wage workers, that is, as workers who must sell their labor power because their conditions of labor confront them as alien property, as an independent alien force. This implies that these conditions of labor confront them as capital. In other words, these means of subsistence and means of labor, or what amounts to the same thing, the disposal of them through the intermediary of money, are in the hands of individual owners of money or of commodities, who as a result become capitalists. The loss of the conditions of labor by the workers is expressed in the fact that these conditions become independent as capital, or as things at the disposal of the capitalists. Thus, primitive accumulation, as I have already shown, means nothing but the separation of labor and the worker from the conditions of labor, which confront him as independent forces. The course of history shows that this separation is a factor in social development. Once capital exists, the capitalist mode of production itself evolves in such a way that it maintains and reproduces this separation on a constantly increasing scale until the historical reversal takes place. It is not the ownership of money which makes the capitalist a capitalist. For money to be transformed into capital, the prerequisites for capitalist production must exist, whose first historical presupposition is that separation. The separation, and therefore the existence of the means of labor as capital, is given in capitalist production. This separation, which constantly reproduces itself and expands, is the foundation of production. Accumulation by means of the reconversion of profit, or surplus product, into capital now becomes a continuous process, as a result of which the increased products of labor, which are at the same time its objective conditions of reproduction, continuously confront labor as capital, i.e. as forces personified in the capitalist, which are alienated from labor and dominate it. Consequently, it becomes a specific function of the capitalist to accumulate, that is, to reconvert a part of the surplus product into conditions of labor. And the stupid economist concludes from this that if this operation did not proceed in this contradictory specific way, it could not take place at all. Reproduction on an extended scale is inseparably connected, in his mind, with accumulation, the capitalist form of this reproduction. Accumulation merely presents as a continuous process what in primitive accumulation appears as a distinct historical process, as the process of the emergence of capital, and as a transition from one mode of production to another. The economists, caught as they are in the toils of the notions proper to the agents of the capitalist mode of production, advance a double quid pro quo, each side of which depends on the other. On the one hand, they transform capital from a relationship into a thing, a stock of commodities, already forgetting that commodities themselves are not things, which, insofar as they serve as conditions of production for new labor, are called capital, and with regard to their mode of reproduction, are called circulating capital. On the other hand, they transform things into capital. That is, they consider the social relationship which is represented in them, and through them, as an attribute which belongs to the thing as such, as soon as it enters as an element into the labor process, or the technological process. On the one hand, the concentration in the hands of non-workers of raw materials and of the disposition over the means of subsistence, i.e. the powers dominating labor, the preliminary condition for the division of labor. Later on, the division of labor increases not only concentration, but also the amount available for concentration by increasing the productivity of labor. In other words, the preliminary accumulation of capital, as the condition for the division of labor, therefore means for them the augmentation or concentration, they do not differentiate between the two, of means of subsistence and means of labor. On the other hand, these necessaries and means of labor would not operate as objective conditions of production if these things did not possess the attribute of being capital, if the product of labor, the condition of labor, did not absorb labor itself, if past labor did not absorb living labor, and if these things did not belong to themselves, or by proxy to the capitalist, instead of to the worker. As if the division of labor was not just as possible if its conditions belonged to the associated workers, although historically it could not at first appear in this form, but can only achieve it as a result of capitalist production, and were regarded by the latter as their own products and the material elements of their own activity, which they are by their very nature. Furthermore, because in the capitalist mode of production, capital appropriates the surplus product of the worker, consequently, because it has appropriated the products of labor, and these now confront the worker in the form of capital, it is clear that the conversion of the surplus product into conditions of labor can only be initiated by the capitalist, and only in the form that he turns the products of labor, which he has appropriated without any equivalent, into means of production of new labor performed without receiving an equivalent. Consequently, the extension of reproduction appears as the transformation of profit into capital, and as a saving by the capitalist, who instead of consuming the surplus product which he has acquired gratis, converts it anew into a means of exploitation, but is able to do this only insofar as he converts the surplus product again into productive capital. This entails the conversion of surplus product into means of labor. As a result, the economists conclude that the surplus product cannot serve as an element of new production if it has not been transformed previously from the product of the worker into the property of his employer, in order to serve as capital once again and to repeat the old process of exploitation. The more inferior economists add to this the idea of hoarding and the accumulation of treasure. Even the better ones, Ricardo for example, transfer the notion of renunciation from the hoarder to the capitalist. The economists do not conceive capital as a relation. They cannot do so without at the same time conceiving it as historically transitory, i.e. a relative, not an absolute, form of production. Hodgkin himself does not share this concept. Insofar as it justifies capital, he does not justify its justification by the economists, but on the contrary refutes it. Thus, Hodgkin is not concerned in all this. As far as matters stood between him and the economists, the kind of polemic he had to wage seemed to be mapped out beforehand and quite simple. To put it simply, he had to vindicate the one aspect which the economists elaborate scientifically against the fetishistic conception they accept without thinking, naively and unconsciously from the capitalist way of looking at things. The utilization of the products of previous labor, of labor in general, as materials, tools, and means of subsistence, is necessary if the worker wants to use his products for new production. This particular mode of consumption of his products is productive. But what on earth has this kind of utilization, this mode of consumption of his product, to do with the domination of his product over him, with its existence as capital, with the accumulation in the hands of individual capitalists of the right to dispose of raw materials and means of subsistence, and the exclusion of the workers from ownership of their products? What has it to do with the fact that, first of all, they have to hand over their products gratis to a third party in order to buy it back again with their own labor? And what is more, they have to give him more labor in exchange than is contained in the product, and thus have to create more surplus product for him. Past labor exists here in two forms. In one, as product, use value. The process of production requires that the workers consume one portion of this product as means of subsistence and use another portion as raw materials and instruments of labor. This applies also to the technological process and merely demonstrates the relations that have to exist in industrial production between the workers and the products of their own labor, their own products, in order to turn them into means of production. Or, past labor exists as value. This only shows that the value of their new product represents not only their present, but also their past labor, and that by increasing it they retain the old value because they increase it. The claim put forward by the capitalist has nothing to do with this process as such. It is true that he has appropriated the products of labor, of past labor, and that he therefore possesses a means for acquiring new products and living labor. This, however, is precisely the kind of procedure against which protests are made. The preliminary concentration and accumulation necessary for the division of labor must not take the form of accumulation of capital. It does not follow that because this concentration is necessary, the capitalist must inevitably have the disposal of the conditions of labor of today created by the labor of yesterday. If accumulation of capital is supposed to be nothing but accumulated labor, it by no means implies the accumulation of other people's labor has to take place. Hodgkin, however, does not follow this simple path, and at first this seems strange. In his polemic against the productivity of capital, to begin with, against circulating and then even more against fixed capital, he seems to oppose or to reject the importance of past labor, or of its product for the reproduction process as a condition of new labor. From this follows the importance of past labor embodied in products for labor as present energy. Why this change? Since the economists identify past labor with capital, past labor being understood in this case not only in the sense of concrete labor embodied in the product, but also in the sense of social labor, materialized labor time, it is understandable that they, the Pindars of capital, emphasize the objective elements of production and overestimate their importance as against the subjective element, living immediate labor. For them, labor only becomes efficacious when it becomes capital and confronts itself, the passive element confronting its active counterpart. The producer is therefore controlled by the product, the subject by the object, labor which is being embodied by labor embodied in an object, etc. In all these conceptions, past labor appears not merely as an objective factor of living labor subsumed by it, but vice versa, not as an element of the power of living labor, but as a power over this labor. The economists ascribe a false importance to the material factors of labor compared with labor itself, in order to have also a technological justification for the specific social form, i.e. the capitalist form, in which the relationship of labor to the conditions of labor is turned upside down, so that it is not the worker who makes use of the conditions of labor, but the conditions of labor which make use of the worker. It is for this reason that Hodgkin asserts, on the contrary, that this physical factor, that is, the entire material wealth, is quite unimportant compared with the living process of production, and that in fact this wealth has no value in itself, but only insofar as it is a factor in the living production process. In doing so, he underestimates somewhat the value which the labor of the past has for the labor of the present, but in opposing economic fetishism, this is quite all right. If in capitalist production, hence in political economy its theoretical expression, past labor were met with only as a pedestal, etc., created by labor itself, then such a controversial issue would not have arisen. It only exists because in the real life of capitalist production, as well as in its theory, materialized labor appears as a contradiction to itself, to living labor. In exactly the same way as in religious reasoning, the product of thought not only claims, but exercises domination over thought itself. The proposition, the effects attributed to a stock of commodities under the name of circulating capital are caused by coexisting labor, means first of all, the simultaneous coexistence of living labor brings about a large part of the effects which are attributed to the product of previous labor called circulating capital. For example, a part of circulating capital consists of the stock of means of subsistence which the capitalist is supposed to have stored up to support the laborer while working. The formation of a reserve stock is by no means a feature peculiar to capitalist production, although since, under it, production and consumption are greater than ever before, the amount of commodities on the market, the amount of commodities in the sphere of circulation, is likewise greater than ever before. Here, memories of hoarding, of accumulation of treasure by hoarders, are still discernible. The consumption fund must be disregarded first of all, because we are speaking here of capital and of industrial production. What has reached the sphere of individual consumption, whether it is consumed more quickly or more slowly, has ceased to be capital. Do all the capitalists of Europe possess at this moment 1 week's food and clothing for all the laborers they employ? Let us first examine the question as to food. One portion of the food of the people is bread, which is never prepared till within a few hours of the time when it is eaten. The produce of the baker cannot be stored up. In no case can the material of bread, whether it exists as corn or as flour, be preserved without continual labor. His conviction that he will obtain bread when he requires it, and his master's conviction that the money he pays him will enable him to obtain it, arise simply from the fact that the bread has always been obtained when required. Another article of the laborer's food is milk, and milk is manufactured twice a day. If it be said that the cattle to supply it are already there, why the answer is they require constant attention and constant labor, and their food, through the greater part of the year, is of daily growth. The fields in which they pasture require the hand of man. The meat also, it cannot be stored up, for it begins instantly to deteriorate after it is brought to market. Because of moths, even of clothing, only a very small stock is ever prepared, compared to the general consumption. Mr. Mill says, and says justly, what is annually produced is annually consumed, so that in fact, to enable men to carry on all these operations which extend beyond a year, there cannot be any stock of commodities stored up. Those who undertake them must rely, therefore, not on any commodities already created, but that other men will labor and produce what they are to subsist on till their own products are completed. Thus, should the laborer admit that some accumulation of circulating capital is necessary for operations terminated within the year, it is plain that in all operations which extend beyond a year, the laborer does not, and he cannot, rely on accumulated capital. It is by the command the capitalist possesses over the labor of some men, not by his possessing a stock of commodities, that he is enabled to support and consequently employ other laborers. The only thing which can be said to be stored up, or previously prepared, is the skill of the laborer. All the effects usually attributed to accumulation of circulating capital are derived from the accumulation and storing up of skilled labor, and this most important operation is performed, as far as the great mass of the laborers is concerned, without any circulating capital whatever. The number of laborers must at all times depend on the quantity of circulating capital, or, as I should say, on the quantity of the products of coexisting labor, which laborers are allowed to consume. Circulating capital is created only for consumption, while fixed capital is made not to be consumed, but to aid the laborer in producing those things which are to be consumed. Thus, first of all, the success and productive power of every different species of labor is at all times more dependent on the coexisting productive labor of other men than on any accumulation of circulating capital. That is, of commodities already created. These already created commodities confront the products of coexisting labor. The part of capital which consists of instruments and materials of labor is, as commodities already created, always a precondition in each particular branch of production. It is impossible to spin cotton which has not yet been produced, to operate spindles which have yet to be manufactured, or to burn coal which has not yet been brought up from the mine. These always enter the production process as forms of existence of previous labor. Existing labor thus depends on antecedent labor, and not only on coexisting labor, although this antecedent labor, whether in the form of means of labor or materials of labor, can only be of any use, that is productive use, when it is in contact with living labor as a material element of it. Only as an element of industrial consumption, i.e. consumption by labor. But when considering circulation and the reproduction process, we have seen that it is only possible to reproduce the commodity after it is finished and converted into money, because simultaneously all its elements have been produced and reproduced by means of coexisting labor. A twofold regression takes place in production. Cotton, for example, advances from one phase of production to another. It is produced first of all as raw material, then it is subjected to a number of operations until it is fit to be exported, or if it is further worked up in the same country, it is handed over to a spinner. It then goes on from the spinner to the weaver, and from the weaver to the bleacher, dyer, finisher, and thence to various workshops where it is worked up for definite uses, i.e. articles of clothing, bed linen, etc. Finally, it leaves the last producer for the consumer and enters into individual consumption if it does not enter into industrial consumption as means, not material, of labor. But whether it is to be consumed industrially or individually, it has acquired its final form as use value. What emerges from one sphere of production as a product enters another as a condition of production, and in this way goes through many successive phases until it reaches its last finish as use value. Here, previous labor appears continually as the condition for existing labor. Simultaneously, however, while the product is advancing in this way from one phase to another, while it is undergoing this real metamorphosis, production is being carried on at every stage. While the weaver spins the yarn, the spinner is simultaneously spinning cotton, and fresh quantities of raw cotton are in the process of production. Since the continuous, constantly repeated process of production is at the same time a process of reproduction, it is therefore equally dependent on the coexisting labor which produces the various phases of the product simultaneously, while the product is passing through metamorphosis from one phase to another. Raw cotton, yarn, fabric are not only produced one after the other and from one another, but they are produced and reproduced simultaneously alongside one another. What appears as the effect of antecedent labor, if one considers the production process of the individual commodity, presents itself at the same time as the effect of coexisting labor, if one considers the reproduction process of the commodity. That is, if one considers this production process in its continuous motion, and in the entirety of its conditions, and not merely as an isolated action or a limited part of it. There exists not only a cycle comprising various phases, but all the phases of the commodity are simultaneously produced in the various spheres and branches of production. If the same peasant just plants flax, then spins it, then weaves it, these operations are performed in succession, but not simultaneously, as the mode of production based on the division of labor within society presupposes. No matter what phase of the production process of an individual commodity is considered, the antecedent labor only acquires significance as a result of the living labor which it provides with the necessary conditions of production. On the other hand, however, these conditions of production, without which living labor cannot realize itself, always appear as the result of antecedent labor. Thus, the cooperating labor of the contributing branches of labor always appear as a passive factor, and as such a passive factor, it is a precondition. The economists emphasize this aspect. In production and circulation, on the other hand, the mediating social labor, on which the production process of the commodity in each particular phase depends and by which it is determined, appears as present, coexisting, contemporaneous labor. The early forms of the commodity and its successive or completed forms are produced simultaneously. Unless this happened, it would not be possible, after it has undergone its real metamorphosis, to reconvert it from money into its conditions of existence. A commodity is thus the product of antecedent labor only insofar as it is the product of contemporaneous living labor. From the capitalist point of view, therefore, all material wealth appears only as a fleeting aspect of the flow of production as a whole, which includes the process of circulation. Subsection C. So-called accumulation as a mere phenomenon of circulation. Stock, etc., circulation reservoirs. Hodgkin examines only one of the constituent parts of circulating capital. One part of circulating capital is, however, continuously converted into fixed capital and auxiliary materials, and only the other part is converted into articles of consumption. Moreover, even that part of circulating capital which is ultimately transformed into commodities intended for individual consumption always exists alongside the final form in which it emerges from the finishing phase as an end product simultaneously in the earlier phases of production in its rudimentary forms, as raw material or semi-manufactured goods removed in various degrees from the final form of the product, in which it cannot as yet enter into consumption. The problem Hodgkin is concerned with is, what is the relation of present labor performed by the worker for the capitalist to the labor embodied in his articles of consumption, the labor contained in those articles on which his wages are spent, which, in actual fact, are the use values of which variable capital consists? It is admitted that the worker cannot labor without finding these articles ready for consumption, and that is why the economists say that circulating capital, the previous labor, commodities already created which the capitalist has stored up, is the condition for labor, and amongst other things, also the condition for the division of labor. When the conditions of production, and especially circulating capital in Hodgkin's sense of the term, are being discussed, it is usual to declare that the capitalist must have accumulated the food which the worker has to consume before his new commodity is finished, while the commodity he produces is only in statu nascendi. This is shot through with the notion that the capitalist either gathers things like a hoarder or that he stores up a supply of food like the bees their honey. This, however, is merely a modus loquendi. First of all, we are not speaking here of the shopkeepers who sell means of subsistence. These must naturally have a full stock in trade. Their stores, shops, etc. are simply reservoirs in which the various commodities are stored up once they are ready for circulation. This kind of storing is merely an interim period in which the commodity remains until it leaves the sphere of circulation and enters that of consumption. It is its mode of existence as a commodity on the market. Strictly speaking, as a commodity, it exists only in this form. It does not affect the matter whether instead of being in the possession of the first seller, that is the producer, the commodity is in the possession of the third or fourth and finally passes into the possession of the seller who sells it to the real consumer. It merely means that in the intermediate stage, exchange of capital for capital is taking place, really of capital plus profit, for the producer sells not only the capital in the commodity but also the profit made on the capital. And in the last stage, exchange of capital for revenue, provided the commodity is intended not for industrial but for individual consumption, as is assumed here. The commodity which is a finished use value and marketable enters the market as a commodity in the phase of circulation. All commodities enter this phase when they undergo their first metamorphosis, the transformation into money. If this is called storing up, then it means nothing more than circulation or the existence of commodities as commodities. This kind of storing is exactly the opposite of treasure hoarding, the aim of which is to retain commodities permanently in the form in which they are capable of entering into circulation, and it achieves this only by withdrawing commodities in the form of money from circulation. If production, and therefore also consumption, is varied and on a mass scale, then a greater quantity of the most diverse commodities will be found continually at this stopping place, at this intermediate station, in a word, in circulation, or on the market. Regarded from the standpoint of quantity, storing on a large scale in this context means nothing more than production and consumption on a large scale. The stop made by commodities, their sojourn at this state of the process, their presence on the market instead of in the mill or in a private house as articles of consumption, or in the shop or the store of the shopkeeper, is only a tiny fraction of time in their life process. The immobile, independent existence of this world of commodities, of things, is only illusory. The station is always full, but always full of different travelers. The same commodities of the same kind, are constantly produced anew in the sphere of production, available on the market and absorbed in consumption. Not the identical commodities, but commodities of the same type can always be found in these three stages simultaneously. If the intermediate stage is prolonged so that the commodities which emerge anew from the sphere of production find the market still occupied by the old ones, then it becomes overcrowded. A stoppage occurs, the market is glutted, the commodities decline in value, there is overproduction. Where, therefore, the intermediate stage of circulation acquires independent existence so that the flow of the stream is not merely slowed down, where the existence of the commodities in the circulation phase appears as storing up, then this is not brought about by a free act on the part of the producer. It is not the aim or an imminent aspect of production, any more than the flow of blood to the head leading to apoplexy is an imminent aspect of the circulation of blood. Capital as commodity capital, and this is the form in which it appears in the circulation phase on the market, must not become stationary. It must only constitute a pause in the movement. Otherwise, the reproduction process is interrupted, and the whole mechanism is thrown into confusion. This materialized wealth, which is concentrated at a few points, is and can only be very small in comparison to the continuous stream of production and consumption. Wealth, therefore, according to Smith, is the annual reproduction. It is not, that is to say, something out of the dim past. It is always something which emerges from yesterday. If, on the other hand, reproduction were to stagnate due to some disturbance or others, then the stores, etc., would soon empty. There would be shortages, and it would soon be evident that the permanency which the existing wealth appears to possess is only the permanency of its being replaced, of its reproduction, that it is a continuous materialization of social labor. The movement C to M to C also takes place in the transactions of the shopkeeper. Insofar as he makes a profit, it is a matter which does not concern us here. He sells goods and buys the same type of goods over again. He sells them to the consumer and buys them again from the producer. Here, the same type of commodity is converted perpetually into money and money back again continuously into the same commodity. This movement, however, simply represents continuous reproduction, continuous production and consumption, for reproduction includes consumption. The commodity must be sold, must reach the sphere of consumption in order that it can be reproduced. It must be accepted as a use value. For C to M for the seller is M to C for the buyer, that is, the conversion of money into a commodity as use value. The reproduction process, since it is a unity of circulation and production, includes consumption, which is itself an aspect of circulation. Consumption is itself both an aspect and a condition of the reproduction process. If one considers the process in its entirety, the shopkeeper in fact pays the producer of the commodities with the same sum of money as the consumer pays him when he buys from him. He represents the consumer in his dealings with the producer, and the producer in his dealings with the consumer. He is both seller and buyer of the same commodity. The money with which he pays is in fact considered from a purely formal standpoint the final metamorphosis of the consumer's commodity. The latter transforms his money into the commodity as a use value. The passing of the money into the shopkeeper's hands thus signifies the consumption of the commodity, or considered formally, the transition of the commodity from circulation into consumption. Insofar as he buys again from the producer with the money, this constitutes the first metamorphosis of the producer's commodity and signifies the transition of the commodity into the intermediate stage, where it remains as a commodity in the sphere of circulation. C to M to C, insofar as it concerns the transformation of the commodity into the consumer's money and the transformation back again of the money, whose owner is now the shopkeeper, into the same commodity, a commodity of the same kind, expresses merely the constant passing over of commodities into consumption, for the vacuum left by the commodity reaching the sphere of consumption must be filled by the commodity emerging from the production process and now entering this stage. The period during which the commodity stays in circulation and is replaced by new commodities naturally depends also on the length of time in which the commodities remain in the production sphere, that is, on the duration of their reproduction time, and varies in accordance with their different length. For example, the reproduction of corn requires a year. The corn harvested in the autumn, for example, of 1862, insofar as it is not used again for seed, must suffice for the whole coming year until autumn of 1863. It is thrown all at once into circulation. It is already in circulation when it is placed in the farmers' granaries and absorbed in the various reservoirs of circulation, storehouses, corn merchants, millers, etc. These reservoirs serve as channels both for the commodities issuing from production and those going to the consumer. As long as the commodities remain in one of them, they are commodities and are therefore on the market, in circulation. They are withdrawn only piecemeal, in small quantities, by the annual consumption. The replacement, the stream of new commodities which are to displace them, arrives only in the following year. Thus, the reservoirs are only depleted gradually, in the measure that their replacements move forward. If there is a surplus, and if the new harvest is above the average, then a stoppage takes place. The space which these particular commodities were to have occupied in the market is overstocked. In order to permit the whole quantity to find a place in the market, the price of the commodities is reduced, and this causes them to move again. If the total quantity of use values is too large, they accommodate themselves to the space they have to occupy by a reduction of their prices. If the quantity is too small, it is expanded by an increase of their prices. On the other hand, commodities which quickly deteriorate as use values remain only for a very short time in the reservoirs of circulation. The period of time during which they have to be converted into money and reproduced is prescribed by the nature of their use value, which, if it is not consumed daily or almost daily, is spoiled and consequently ceases to be a commodity. For exchange value, along with its basis, use value, disappears provided the disappearance of use value is not itself an act of production. In general, it is clear that although in absolute terms the quantity of the commodities which have been stored up in the reservoirs of circulation increases as a result of the development of industry, because production and consumption increase, this same quantity, represents a decrease in comparison with the total annual production and consumption. The transition of commodities from circulation to consumption takes place more rapidly, and for the following reasons. The speed of reproduction increases, firstly, when the commodity passes rapidly through its various production phases. That is, when each production phase of the production process is reduced in length. This is due to the fact that the labor time necessary to produce the commodity in each one of its forms is reduced. This is a result, therefore, of the development of the division of labor, use of machinery, application of chemical processes, etc. The development of chemistry makes it possible to speed up the transition of commodities from one state of aggregation to another, their combination with other material which, for instance, occurs in dyeing, their separation from other substances as in bleaching. In short, both modifications in the form of the same substance, its state of aggregation, as well as changes to be brought about in the substance are artificially accelerated quite apart from the fact that for vegetative and organic reproduction, plants, animals, etc. are supplied with cheaper substances, that is, substances which cost less labor time. Secondly, partly as a result of the combination of various branches of industry, that is, the establishment of centers of production for particular industrial branches, partly through the development of means of communication. The commodity proceeds rapidly from one phase to another. In other words, the interim period, the interval during which the commodity remains in the intermediate station between one production phase and another, is reduced. That is, the transition from one phase of production to another is shortened. Thirdly, this whole development, the shortening both of the various phases of the production process and of the transition from one phase to another, presupposes production on a large scale, mass production, and at the same time, production based on a large amount of constant capital, especially fixed capital. It requires, therefore, a continuous flow of production, but not in the sense in which we have earlier considered the flow, that is, not as the closing of and overlapping of the separate production phases, but in the sense that there are no deliberate breaks in production. These occur as long as work is done to order, as in the handicrafts, and continue even in manufacture properly so called, insofar as this has not been reshaped by large-scale industry. In modern industry, however, work is carried out on the scale allowed by the capital. This process does not wait on demand, but is a function of capital. Capital works on the same scale continuously, if one disregards accumulation or expansion, and constantly develops and extends the productive forces. Production is, therefore, not only rapid, so that the commodity quickly acquires the form in which it is suitable for circulation, but is continuous. Production here appears only as constant reproduction, and at the same time it takes place on a mass scale. Thus, if the commodities remain in the circulation reservoirs for a long time, if they accumulate there, then they will soon glut them as a result of the speed with which the waves of production follow one another and the huge amounts of goods which they deposit continually in the reservoirs. It is in this sense that Courbet, for example, says the market is always overstocked. But the same circumstances which produce this speed and mass scale of reproduction likewise reduce the necessity for the accumulation of commodities in the reservoirs. In part, insofar as it is concerned with industrial consumption, this is already implied by the close succession of the production phases which the commodity itself or its ingredients have to undergo. If coal is produced daily on a mass scale and brought to the manufacturer's door by railways, steamships, etc., he does not need to have a stock of coal, or at most only a very small one. Or what amounts to the same thing, if a merchant acts as an intermediary, he only needs to keep a small amount of stock over and above the amount he sells daily, and which is daily delivered to him. The same applies to yarn, iron, etc. But apart from industrial consumption, in which the stock of commodities, that is, the stock of the ingredients of commodities, must decline in this way, the shopkeeper likewise enjoys the benefits of the speed of communications, first of all, and secondly, the certainty of a continuous and rapid renewal and delivery. Although his stock of commodities may grow in size, each element of it will remain in his reservoir in a state of transition for a shorter period of time. In relation to the total amount of commodities which he sells, that is, in relation to the scale of both production and consumption, the stock of commodities which he accumulates and keeps in store will be small. It is different in the less developed stages of production, where reproduction proceeds slowly, where therefore more commodities must remain in the circulation reservoirs. The means of transport are slow, the communications difficult, and as a consequence, the renewal of stock can be interrupted, and a great deal of time elapses as a result between the emptying and the refilling of the reservoir. That is, the renewal of the stock in hand. The position is then similar to that of products whose reproduction takes place yearly or half-yearly, in short, in more or less prolonged periods of time owing to the nature of their use values. For example, cotton is an illustration of how transport and communications affect the emptying of the reservoir. Since ships continually ply between Liverpool and the United States, speed of communications is one factor, continuity another, all the cotton supply is not shipped at once. It comes onto the market gradually. The producer likewise does not want to flood the market all at once. It lies at the docks in Liverpool, that is already in a kind of circulation reservoir, but not in such quantities, in relation to the total consumption of the article, as would be required if the ship from America arrived only once or twice a year, after a journey of 6 months. The cotton manufacturer in Manchester and other places stocks his warehouse roughly in accordance with his immediate consumption needs, since the electric telegraph and the railway make the transfer from Liverpool to Manchester possible at a moment's notice. Special filling of the reservoirs, insofar as this is not due to the overstocking of the market, which can happen much more easily in these circumstances than under archaically slow conditions, occurs only for speculative reasons and merely in exceptional cases because of a real or suspected fall or rise of prices. Regarding this relative decline in stock, that is, the commodities which are in circulation, compared with the amount of production and consumption, see Laylor, The Economist. Courbet. Sismondi wrongly saw something lamentable in all this. On the other hand, there is indeed a continuous extension of the market, and in the degree that the interval of time decreases in which the commodity remains on the market, its flow in space increases. That is, the market expands spatially, and the periphery in relation to the center, the production sphere of the commodity, is circumscribed by a constantly extending radius. The fact that consumption lives from hand to mouth, changes its linen and its coat as rapidly as does its opinions, and does not wear the same coat 10 years running, etc., is connected with the speed of reproduction, or is another expression of it. To an increasing extent, consumption, even of articles where this is not demanded by the nature of their use value, takes place almost simultaneously with production, and becomes therefore more and more dependent on the present coexisting labor, since it is in fact exchange of coexisting labor. This takes place in the same degree in which past labor becomes an ever more important factor of production, even though this past itself is after all a very recent and only relative one. The following example demonstrates how closely the keeping of a stock is linked with deficiencies of production. As long as it is difficult to keep cattle throughout the winter, there is no fresh meat in winter. As soon as stock farming is able to overcome this difficulty, the stock previously made up of substitutes for fresh meat, pickled or smoked varieties, ceases of itself. The product only becomes a commodity where it enters into circulation. The production of goods as commodities, hence circulation, expands enormously as a result of capitalist production for the following reasons. 1. Production takes place on a large scale. The quantity, the large amounts produced, therefore, do not stand in any kind of quantitative relationship to the producer's needs of his own product. In fact, it is pure chance whether he consumes any, even a small part of his own product. He only consumes his own product on a mass scale, where he produces some of the ingredients of his own capital. On the other hand, in the earlier stages of economic development, only those products which exceed the amount required by the producer himself become commodities, or at any rate, this is mainly the case. 2. The narrow range of goods produced stands in inverse ratio to the increased variety of needs. This is due to previously combined branches of production becoming increasingly separated and independent. In short, to increasing division of labor within society. A contributing factor is the establishment of new branches of production and the increasing variety of commodities produced. This increased variety and differentiation of commodities arises in two ways. The different phases of one and the same product, as well as the auxiliary operations, that is, the labor connected with various constituent parts, etc., are separated and become different branches of production, independent of one another, or various phases of one product become different commodities. But secondly, owing to labor and capital, or labor and surplus product, becoming free. On the other hand, to the discovery of new practical applications of the same use value, either because new needs arise as a result of the modification of number one, for example, the need for more rapid and universal means of transport and communication, arising with the application of steam in industry, and therefore new means of satisfying them, or new possibilities of utilizing the same use value are discovered, or new substances or new methods, plastic galvanization, for instance, for treating well-known substance in different ways. All this amounts to the following. Successive phases or states of one product are converted into separate commodities. New products or new values in use are created and become commodities. 3. Transformation of the majority of the population who formerly consumed a mass of products in natural form into wage workers. 4. Transformation of the tenant farmer into an industrial capitalist, and with it the conversion of rent into money rent, and generally all payments in kind, taxes, rent, etc., into money payments. In general, industrial exploitation of the land, with the result that it is no longer confined to its own muck heap as previously, but that both its chemical and mechanical conditions of production, even seeds, fertilizers, cattle, etc., are subjected to the process of exchange. 5. Mobilization of a mass of previously inalienable possessions by conversion into commodities and the creation of forms of property which only exist in negotiable papers. On the one hand, alienation of landed property, the lack of property of the masses, causes them, for example, to regard the dwelling in which they live as a commodity. On the other hand, railway shares, in short, all kinds of shares. Subsection D. Hodgkin's polemic against the conception that the capitalists store up means of subsistence for the workers. His failure to understand the real causes of the fetishism of capital. Back again to Hodgkin now. It is obvious that by storing up means of subsistence for the workers by the capitalists, one cannot understand that commodities which are passing from production into consumption are in the circulation reservoirs, in the circulation system, on the market. This would mean that the products circulate for the benefit of the worker and become commodities for his sake, and that in general the production of products as commodities is undertaken for his sake. The worker shares with every other commodity owner the need to transform the commodity he sells, which in actual fact, though not in form, is his labor, at first into money in order to convert the money back again into commodities which he can consume. It is perfectly obvious that no division of labor, insofar as it is based on commodity production, no wage labor, and in general no capitalist production can take place without commodities, whether they be means of consumption or means of production, being available on the market. That this kind of production is impossible without commodity circulation, without the commodity spending a period of time in the circulation reservoir. For the product is a commodity in the strict sense of the word only within the framework of circulation. It is as true for the worker as for anybody else that he must find his means of subsistence in the form of commodities. The worker, moreover, does not confront the shopkeeper as a worker confronts a capitalist, but as money confronts the commodity, as a buyer faces a seller. There is no relationship of wage labor to capital here, except of course where the shopkeeper is dealing with his own workers. But even they, insofar as they buy things from him, do not confront him as workers. They confront him as workers only insofar as he buys from them. Let us therefore leave this circulation agent. But as far as the industrial capitalist is concerned, his stock, his accumulation consists of, first, his fixed capital, i.e. buildings, machinery, etc., which the worker does not consume, or insofar as he does consume them, does so through labor, and thus consumes them industrially for the capitalist. And although they are means of labor, they are not means of subsistence for him. Secondly, his raw materials and auxiliary materials, the stock of which, insofar as it does not enter directly into production, declines, as we have seen. This likewise does not consist of means of subsistence for the workers. This accumulation by the capitalist for the workers means nothing more than that he does the worker the favor of depriving the latter of his conditions of labor and converting the means of his labor, which are themselves merely the transformed product of his labor, into means for the exploitation of labor. In any case, the worker, while he uses the machine and the raw materials, does not live on them. Thirdly, the commodities, which he keeps in the storehouse or warehouse before they enter into circulation. These are products of labor, not means of subsistence stored in order to maintain labor during the course of production. Thus, the accumulation of means of subsistence by the capitalist for the worker means merely that he must possess enough money in order to pay wages, with which the worker withdraws the articles of consumption he needs from the circulation reservoir, and if we consider the working class as a whole, with which he buys back part of his own product. This money, however, is simply the transformed form of the commodity which the worker has sold and handed over. In this sense, the means of subsistence are stored up for him in the same way as they are stored up for his capitalist, who likewise buys consumption goods, etc., with money, the transformed form of the same commodity. This money may be a mere token of value. It therefore does not have to be a representation of previous labor, but in the hands of whoever possesses it, simply expresses the realized price not of past labor or previously sold commodities, but of the contemporaneous labor or commodities which he sells. Money has merely a formal existence. Or, since in previous modes of production, the worker also had to eat and consume during the course of production, irrespective of the period of time required for the production of his product, storing up may mean that the worker must first of all transform the product of his labor into the product of the capitalist, into capital, in order to receive back a portion of it in the form of money in lieu of payment. What interests Hodgkin about this whole process, with regard to the process as such, it is indeed a matter of indifference whether the worker receives the product of contemporaneous or previous labor, just as it does not matter whether he receives the product of his own previous labor or the product of labor performed simultaneously in a different branch, is this. A great part, or the greatest part of the products consumed daily by the worker, which he must consume whether his own product is finished or not, represent by no means stored up labor of bygone time. On the contrary, he uses, to a large extent, products of labor performed the same day or during the same week in which the worker produces his own commodity. For example, bread, meat, beer, milk, newspapers, etc. Hodgkin could also have added that they are partly the products of future labor, for the worker who buys an overcoat with what he has saved out of 6 months' wages buys one which has only been made at the end of the 6 months, etc. We have seen that the whole of production presupposes simultaneous reproduction of the required constituent parts and products in their different forms as raw materials, semi-manufactured goods, etc. But all fixed capital presupposes future labor for its reproduction and for the reproduction of its equivalent, without which it cannot be reproduced. Hodgkin says that during the course of the year, the worker must rely to some degree on previous labor because of the nature of corn, vegetable raw materials, etc. This does not apply to a house, for example. As regards use values, which by their nature only wear out slowly, are not consumed at once, but gradually used up, it is not due to any action specially devised for the benefit of the workers that these products of previous labor are available on the market. The worker also used to have a dwelling before the capitalist piled up deadly stinkholes for him. See Lang on this. Apart from the enormous mass of day-to-day needs, which are of decisive importance especially to the worker, who, at best, can only satisfy his everyday needs, we have seen that in general, consumption becomes more and more contemporaneous with production, and therefore if one considers society as a whole, consumption depends more and more on simultaneous production, or rather on the products of simultaneous production. But when operations extend over several years, the worker must depend on his own production, on the simultaneous and future producers of other commodities. The worker always has to find his means of subsistence in the form of commodities on the market. The services he buys are ipso facto only brought into being at the moment they are bought. As far as he is concerned, they must therefore be the products of antecedent labor, that is, of labor which is antecedent to their existence as products, but which is by no means antecedent to his own labor with whose price he buys these products. They can be, and mostly are, contemporaneous products, especially for those who live from hand to mouth. Taking it all in all, the storing up of means of subsistence for the workers by the capitalist comes to this. 1. Commodity production presupposes that articles of consumption which one does not produce oneself are available on the market as commodities, or that in general, commodities are produced as commodities. 2. The majority of the commodities consumed by the worker, in the final form in which they confront him as commodities, are in fact products of simultaneous labor. They are therefore by no means stored up by the capitalist. 3. In capitalist production, the means of labor and the means of subsistence produced by the worker himself confront him as capital. The one is constant, the other is variable capital. These, the worker's conditions of production, appear as the property of the capitalist. Their transfer from the worker to the capitalist, and the partial return of the worker's product to the worker, or of the value of his product to the worker, is called the storing up of circulating capital for the worker. These means of subsistence, which the worker must always consume before his product is finished, become circulating capital, because the worker, instead of buying them direct or paying for them with the value of either his past or of his future product, must first of all receive a draft on it. A draft, moreover, which the capitalist is entitled to issue only thanks to the worker's past, present, or future product. Hodgkin is concerned here with demonstrating the dependence of the worker on the coexisting labor of other workers as against his dependence on previous labor. Firstly, in order to do away with the phrase about storing up. Secondly, because present labor confronts capital, whereas the economists always consider previous labor as such to be capital, that is, an alienated and independent form of labor which is hostile to labor itself. To grasp the all-round significance of contemporaneous labor as against previous labor is, however, in itself a very important achievement. Hodgkin thus arrives at the following. Capital is either a mere name and pretext, or it does not express a thing. The social relation of the labor of one person to the coexisting labor of another, and the consequences, the effects of this relationship, are ascribed to the things which make up so-called circulating capital. Despite the fact that the commodity exists as money, its realization in use values depends on contemporaneous labor. The labor performed in the course of a year is itself contemporaneous labor. Only a small portion of the commodities entering into direct consumption are the product of more than 1 year's labor, and when they are, such as cattle, etc., they require renewed labor every year. All operations requiring more than a year depend on continuous annual production. It is by the command the capitalist possesses over the labor of some men, not by his possessing a stock of commodities, that he is enabled to support and consequently employ other laborers. Money, however, gives everyone command over the labor of some men, over the labor contained in their commodities as well as over the reproduction of this labor, and to that extent, therefore, over labor itself. What is really stored up, not however as a dead mass but as something living, is the skill of the worker, the level of development of labor. It is true, however, that the stage of development of the productivity of labor which exists at any particular time and serves as the starting point comprises not only the skill and capacity of the worker, but likewise the material means which this labor has created and which it daily renews. Hodgkin does not emphasize this because, in opposing the crude views of the economists, it is important for him to lay the stress on the subject, so to speak, on the subjective in the subject, in contrast to the object. This is really the primary factor, the point of departure, and it is the result of a process of development. Accumulation, in this context, means assimilation, continual preservation, and at the same time, transformation of what has already been handed over and realized. In this way, Darwin makes accumulation through inheritance the driving principle in the formation of all organic things, of plants and animals. Thus, the various organisms themselves are formed as a result of accumulation, and are only inventions, gradually accumulated inventions of living beings. But this is not the only prerequisite of production. Such a prerequisite in the case of animals and plants is external nature, that is, both inorganic nature and their relationship with other animals and plants. Man, who produces in society, likewise faces an already modified nature, and in particular natural factors which have been transformed into means of his own activity, and definite relations existing between the producers. This accumulation is in part the result of the historical process, in part, as far as the individual worker is concerned, transmission of skill. Hodgkin says that as far as the majority of workers are concerned, circulating capital plays no part in this accumulation. He has demonstrated that the stock of commodities, means of subsistence, prepared, is always small in comparison with the total amount of consumption and production. On the other hand, the degree of skill of the existing population is always the precondition of production as a whole. It is therefore the principal accumulation of wealth and the most important result of antecedent labor. Its form of existence, however, is living labor itself. All the effects usually attributed to accumulation of circulating capital are derived from the accumulation and storing up of skilled labor. And this most important operation is performed, as far as the great mass of laborers is concerned, without any circulating capital whatever. With regard to the assertion of the economists that the number of workers, and therefore the well-being or poverty of the existing working population, depends on the amount of circulating capital available, Hodgkin comments correctly as follows. The number of laborers must at all times depend on the quantity of circulating capital, or as I should say, on the quantity of products of coexisting labor, which laborers are allowed to consume. What is attributed to circulating capital, to a stock of commodities, is the effect of coexisting labor. In other words, Hodgkin says that the effects of a certain social form of labor are ascribed to objects, to the products of labor. The relationship itself is imagined to exist in a material form. We have already seen that this is a characteristic of labor based on commodity production, on exchange value, and this quid pro quo is revealed in the commodity, in money. Hodgkin does not see this, and to a still higher degree in capital. The effects of things as materialized aspects of the labor process are attributed to them in capital, in their personification, their independence in respect of labor. They would cease to have these effects if they were to cease to confront labor in this alienated form. The capitalist, as capitalist, is simply the personification of capital, that creation of labor endowed with its own will and personality which stands in opposition to labor. Hodgkin regards this as a pure subjective illusion which conceals the deceit and the interests of the exploiting classes. He does not see that the way of looking at things arises out of the actual relationship itself. The latter is not an expression of the former, but vice versa. In the same way, English socialists say we need capital, but not the capitalists. But if one eliminates the capitalists, the means of production cease to be capital. The verbal observer, Bailey, and others remark that value express a property of things. In fact, the terms originally express nothing but the use value of things for people, those qualities which make them useful or agreeable, etc., to people. It is in the nature of things that value can have no other etymological origin. Use value expresses the natural relationship between things and men, in fact, the existence of things for men. Exchange value, as the result of the social development which created it, was later superimposed on the word value, which was synonymous with use value. Exchange value is the social existence of things. Hodgkin now turns to fixed capital. It is productive power which has been produced, and in its development in large-scale industry is an instrument which social labor has created. As far as fixed capital is concerned, all instruments and machines are the produce of labor. As long as they are merely the result of previous labor and are not applied to their respective uses by laborers, they do not repay the expense of making them. Most of them diminish in value from being kept. Fixed capital does not derive its utility from previous, but present labor, and does not bring its owner a profit because it has been stored up, but because it is a means of obtaining command over labor. Here at last, the nature of capital is understood correctly. After any instruments have been made, what do they effect? Nothing. On the contrary, they begin to rust or decay unless used or applied by labor. Whether an instrument shall be regarded as productive capital or not depends entirely on its being used or not by some productive laborer. One easily comprehends why the road maker should receive some of the benefits accruing only to the road user, but I do not comprehend why all these benefits should go to the road itself and be appropriated by a set of persons who neither make nor use it under the name of profit for their capital. Its vast utility does not depend on stored-up iron and wood, but on that practical and living knowledge of the powers of nature which enables some men to construct it and others to guide it. Without knowledge, the machines could not be invented. Without manual skill and dexterity, they could not be made, and without skill and labor, they could not be productively used. But there is nothing more than knowledge, skill, and labor requisite on which the capitalist can found a claim to any share of the produce. After man has inherited the knowledge of several generations, and when he lives congregated in great masses, he is enabled by his mental faculties to complete the work of nature. It is not the quantity, but the quality of the fixed capital on which the productive industry of a country depends. Fixed capital, as a means of nourishing and supporting men, depends for its efficiency altogether on the skill of the laborers, and consequently, the productive industry of a country, as far as the fixed capital is concerned, is in proportion to the knowledge and skill of the people.
Subsection E. Compound interest. Fall in the rate of profit based on this. A mere glance must satisfy every mind that simple profit does not decrease but increase in the progress of society. That is, the same quantity of labor, which at any former period produced 100 quarters of wheat and 100 steam engines, will now produce somewhat more. In fact, also, we find that a much greater number of persons now live in opulence on profit in this country than formerly. It is clear, however, that no labor, no productive power, no ingenuity, and no art can answer the overwhelming demands of compound interest. But all saving is made from the revenue, that is, from simple profit, of the capitalist, so that actually these demands are constantly made, and as constantly the productive power of labor refuses to satisfy them. A sort of balance is therefore constantly struck. For example, if the profit were always accumulated, a capital of 100 at 10% would amount to something like 673, or since a little more or less makes no difference here, say 700, in 20 years. Thus, the capital will have multiplied itself sevenfold over a period of 20 years. According to this yardstick, if only simple interest were paid, it would have to be 30% per annum instead of 10%, that is 3 times as much profit. And the more we increase the number of years that elapse, the more the rate of interest or the rate of profit calculated at simple interest per annum will increase. And this increase is the more rapid the larger the capital becomes. In fact, however, capitalist accumulation is nothing but the reconversion of interest into capital, since interest and profit for our purpose, i.e. for the purpose of our calculation, are identical. Thus, it is compound interest. First, there is a capital of 100. It yields 10% profit, or interest. This is added to the capital, which is now 110. This now becomes the capital. The interest on this amount is therefore not simply interest on a capital of 100, but interest on 100 capital plus 10 interest. That is compound interest. Thus, at the end of the second year, we have 100 capital plus 10 interest plus 10 interest plus 1 interest equals 121. This is the capital at the beginning of the third year. In the third year, we get 100 capital plus 10 interest plus 11 interest plus 12 1/10 interest, so that at the end of it, the capital is 133 1/10, etc. In other words, more than half of the capital is made up of interest in the ninth year, and the portion of capital consisting of interest thus increases in geometrical progression. We have seen that over 20 years, capital increased sevenfold, whereas even according to the most extreme assumption of Malthus, the population can only double itself every 25 years. But let us assume that it doubles itself in 20 years, and therefore the working population as well. Taking 1 year with another, the interest would have to be 30%, 3 times greater than it is. If one assumes, however, that the rate of exploitation remained unchanged, in 20 years the doubled population would only be able to produce twice as much labor as it did previously, and the new generation would be unfit for work during a considerable part of these 20 years. Scarcely during half this period would it be able to work, in spite of the employment of children. It would therefore produce only twice as much surplus labor, but not 3 times as much. The rate of profit, and consequently the rate of interest, is determined, Firstly, if the rate of exploitation is assumed to be constant by the number of workers in employment, by the absolute mass of workers employed, that is, by the growth of the population. Although this number increases, its ratio to the total amount of capital employed declines with the accumulation of capital and with industrial development. Consequently, the rate of profit declines if the rate of exploitation remains the same. Likewise, the population does not by any means increase in the same geometrical progression as the computed compound interest. The growth of the population at a given stage of industrial development is the explanation for the increase in the amount of surplus value and of profit, but also for the fall in the rate of profit. Secondly, by the absolute length of the normal working day, that is, by increasing the rate of surplus value. Thus, the rate of profit can increase as a result of the extension of labor time beyond the normal working day. However, this has its physical and, by and large, its social limits. That in the same measure as workers set more capital in motion, the same capital commands more absolute labor time is out of the question. Thirdly, if the normal working day remains the same, surplus labor can be increased relatively by reducing the necessary labor time and reducing the prices of the necessaries which the worker consumes, in comparison with the development of the productive power of labor. But this very development of productive power reduces variable capital relative to constant. It is physically impossible that the surplus labor time of, say, 2 men who displace 20 can by any conceivable increase of the absolute or relative surplus labor time equal that of the 20. If each of the 20 men only work 2 hours of surplus labor a day, the total will be 40 hours of surplus labor, whereas the total lifespan of the 2 men only amounts to 48 hours in one day. The value of labor power does not fall in the same degree as the productivity of labor or of capital increases. This increase in productive power likewise increases the ratio between constant and variable capital in all branches of industry which do not produce necessaries, either directly or indirectly, without giving rise to any kind of alteration in the value of labor. The development of productive power is not even. It is in the nature of capitalist production that it develops industry more rapidly than agriculture. This is not due to the nature of the land, but to the fact that in order to be exploited really in accordance with its nature, land requires different social relations. Capitalist production turns towards the land only after its influence has exhausted it and after it has devastated its natural qualities. An additional factor is that as a consequence of land ownership, agricultural products are expensive compared with other commodities because they are sold at their value and are not reduced to their cost price. They form, however, the principal constituent of the necessaries. Furthermore, if 1/10 of the land is dearer to exploit than the other 9/10, these latter are likewise hit artificially by this relative barrenness as a result of the law of competition. The rate of profit would in fact have to grow if it is to remain constant while accumulation of capital is taking place. The same worker, as long as capital yields 10 of surplus labor, must, as soon as interest accumulates on interest and thus increases the capital employed, produce 3-fold, 4-fold, 5-fold in progression of compound interest, which is nonsense. The amount of capital which the worker sets in motion, and whose value is maintained and reproduced by his labor, is something quite different from the value which he adds, and therefore from the surplus value. If the amount of capital is 1,000, and the labor added equals 100, then the capital reproduced amounts to 1,100. If the capital is 100 and the labor added is 20, then the capital reproduced is 120. The rate of profit in the first case is 10%, and in the second it is 20%. Nevertheless, more can be accumulated from 100 than from 20. Thus, the flow of capital, or its accumulation, continues, apart from the reduction in its value as a result of the increase in productive power, in proportion to the force it already possesses, but not in proportion to the size of the rate of profit. This explains that accumulation, its amount, may increase in spite of a falling rate of profit, apart from the fact that while productivity rises, a larger portion of the revenue can be accumulated, even when the rate of profit declines, than when there is a higher rate of profit together with lower productivity. A high rate of profit, insofar as it is based on a high rate of surplus value, is possible if very long hours are worked, although the labor is unproductive. It is possible because the worker's needs, and therefore the minimum wage, are small, although the labor is unproductive. The lack of energy with which the labor is performed will correspond to the low level of the minimum wage. Capital is accumulated slowly in both cases despite the high rate of profit. The population is stagnant and the labor time which the product costs is high, although the wages received by the workers are small. I have explained the decline in the rate of profit in spite of the fact that the rate of surplus value remains the same or even rises by the decrease of the variable capital in relation to the constant, that is, of the living present labor in relation to the past labor which is employed and reproduced. Hodgkin, and the man who wrote The Source and Remedy of the National Difficulties, explain it by the fact that it is impossible for the worker to fulfill the demands of capital, which accumulates like compound interest. No labor, no productive power, no ingenuity, and no art can answer the overwhelming demands of compound interest. but all saving is made from the revenue of the capitalist, that is, from simple profit. So that actually, these demands are constantly made, and as constantly, the productive power of labor refuses to satisfy them. A sort of balance is therefore constantly struck. In its general sense, this amounts to the same thing. If I say that as capital accumulates, the rate of profit declines because constant capital increases in relation to variable capital, it means that disregarding the specific form of the different portions of capital, the capital employed increases in relation to the labor employed. The rate of profit falls not because the worker is exploited less, but because altogether less labor is employed in relation to the capital employed. For example, let us assume that the ratio of variable to constant capital is 1:1. Then, if the total capital amounts to 1,000, constant capital will be 500 and variable capital likewise 500. If the rate of surplus value is 50%, then 50% of 500 is 50 times 5, or 250. Thus, the rate of profit on 1,000 yields a profit of 250, or 250 over 1,000 being 25%. If the total capital is 1,000, and if constant capital equals 750 and variable capital 250, then at a rate of surplus value of 50%, 250 will yield 125. But 125 over 1,000 comes to 12.5%. But in comparison with the first case, less living labor is employed in the second case. If we assume that the annual wage of workers is £25, then in the first case, £500 wages will employ 20 workers. In the second case, £250 wages will employ 10 workers. The same capital, £1,000, employs 20 workers in one case and only 10 in the other. In the first case, the ratio of the total capital to the number of working days is as 1,000 to 20. In the second, as 1,000 to 10. In the first case, for each of the 20 workers, 50 pounds of capital, constant and variable, is used. In the second case, the capital employed per individual worker is 100 pounds. Nevertheless, in both cases, the capital which is allocated to wages is, pro rata, the same. The formula I have given provides new ground for explaining why, with accumulation, less workers are employed by the same amount of capital, or what amounts to the same thing, why a greater amount of capital has to be used for the same amount of labor. It comes to the same thing if I say that one worker is employed for a capital outlay of 50 in the one case and one worker for a capital outlay of 100 in the other, that therefore only half the number of workers is employed by a capital of 50. In other words, if I say that in one case there is one worker for 50 capital and only half a worker for 50 capital in the other, or if I say that in the one case 50 capital is used by one worker and in the other case 50 times 2 capital is used by one worker. This latter formula is the one used by Hodgkin and others. According to them, accumulation means in general the demand for compound interest. In other words, that more capital is expended on one worker, and that he has therefore to produce more surplus labor proportionally to the amount of capital expended on him. Since the capital expended on him increases at the same rate as compound interest, but on the other hand his labor time has very definite limits, which even relatively, no development of productive powers can reduce in accordance with the demands of this compound interest, a sort of balance is constantly struck. Simple profit remains the same, or rather it grows. This is in fact the surplus labor or surplus value. But as the result of the accumulation of capital, it is compound interest which is disguised in the form of simple interest. It is clear furthermore that if compound interest equals accumulation, then apart from the absolute limits of accumulation, the growth of this interest depends on the extent, the intensity, etc. of the accumulation process itself, that is, on the mode of production. Otherwise, compound interest is nothing but appropriation of the capital of others in the form of interest, as was the case in Rome and in general with usurers. Hodgkin's view is as follows. Originally, 50 pounds capital, for example, falls to the share of one worker, on which he produces, let us say, a profit of 25 pounds. Later, as a result of the conversion of a part of the interest into capital, and of the fact that this process repeats itself again and again, a capital of 200 pounds is allocated to the worker. If the entire interest of 50% received per annum was always capitalized, the process would be complete in less than 4 years. Just as the worker produced a profit of 25 on a capital of 50, he is now expected to produce a profit of 100 on a capital of 200, or 4 times as much. But that is impossible. To do that, either the worker would have to work 4 times as long, that is 48 hours a day if he worked 12 hours previously, or the value of labor would have to fall by 75% as a result of increased productivity of labor. If the working day is 12 hours, 25 pounds the annual wage, and the worker produces 25 pounds profit per annum, then he has to work as much for the capitalist as he does for himself, that is, for 6 hours or half the working day. In order to produce 100, he would have to work 4 times 6 hours for the capitalist in a 12-hour working day, which is nonsense. Let us assume that the working day is lengthened to 15 hours. Then the worker still cannot produce 24 hours work in 15 hours. And still less can he work for 30 hours, which is what would be necessary since he would have to work 24 hours for the capitalist and 6 for himself. If he worked the whole of his working time for the capitalist, he would be able to produce only 50 pounds. He would only double the amount of interest. That is, he would produce 50 profit on a capital of 200, whereas he produced 25 for 50 capital. The rate of profit is 50% in the second case and 25% in the first. But even this is impossible, since the worker must live, no matter how much productive power increases. If, as in the above example, the value of 12 hours is 75, then that of 24 hours adds up to 2 times 75, or 150. And since the worker must live, he can never produce 150 profit, still less 200. His surplus labor is always a part of his working day, from which it does not at all follow, as Mr. Robertus thinks, that profit can never reach 100%. It can never be 100% if it is calculated on the working day as a whole, for it is itself included in it. But it can most certainly be 100% in relation to that part of the working day which is paid for. Let us take the above example of 50%. Constant capital at 25, variable capital at 25, surplus value at 25. The rate of surplus value is 100% and the rate of profit is 50%. If the worker worked 3/4 of the day for the capitalist, then we have constant capital at 25, variable capital at 12.5, surplus value at 37.5, the rate of surplus value is 300%, and the rate of profit is 100%. The total capital is 37.5. Calculated on a capital of 100, constant capital is 66 2/3, variable capital is 33 1/3, surplus value is 100, the rate of surplus value is 300%, and the rate of profit is 100%. Let us examine this a little more closely and see what is implied by the view that the rate of profit falls because, in consequence of progressive accumulation, it does not constitute simple profit, but compound profit, and that it is impossible for labor to keep pace with the demands of compound interest. Consequently, the rate of exploitation of the worker does not decline, but as Hodgkin says, increases. It has to be noted, first of all, that this has to be defined in more detail if it is to make any sense at all. Regarded as a product of accumulation, that is, of the appropriation of surplus labor, and this approach is necessary if one considers reproduction as a whole, all capital is made up of profit, or of interest if this word is considered to be synonymous with profit, and not with interest in the strict sense. If the rate of profit is 10%, then this is compound interest, compound profit, and it would be impossible to see how 10 to 100 could, in economic terms, differ from 11 to 110. So what emerges is that simple profit, too, is impossible, or at least that simple profit must also decline, because in fact, simple profit is made up in exactly the same way as compound profit. If one narrows the problem, that is, considers solely interest-bearing capital, then compound interest would swallow up profit and more than profit. And the fact that the producer, capitalist or not, has to pay the lender compound interest means that sooner or later, in addition to profit, he has to pay him part of his capital as well. Thus, it should be noted, first of all, that Hodgkin's view only has meaning if it is assumed that capital grows more rapidly than population, that is, than the working population. Even this latter is a relative growth. It is in the nature of capitalism to overwork one section of the working population while it turns another into paupers. If the population grows at the same rate as capital, then there is no reason whatsoever why I should not be able to extract from 8x workers with 800 pounds the same rate of surplus labor that I can extract from x workers with 100 pounds. 8 times 100 capital makes no greater demand on 8 times x workers than 100 capital on x workers. Thus, Hodgkin's argument becomes groundless. In reality, things turn out differently. Even if the population grows at the same rate as capital, capitalist development nevertheless results in one part of the population being made redundant, because constant capital develops at the expense of variable capital. Quote, "It is very material, with reference to labor, whether you distribute goods so as to induce a greater supply of labor or a less, whether you distribute them where they will be conditions for labor or where they will be opportunities for idleness. That increased supply of labor is promoted by the increased numbers of mankind. The not being able to command so much labor as before, too, is only important where that labor would produce no more than before. If labor has been rendered more productive, production will not be checked, though the existing mass of commodities should command less labor than before." This is directed against Malthus. True, production would not be checked, but the rate of profit would. These cynical propositions, stating that a mass of commodities commands labor, reflect the same cynicism which finds expression in Malthus's explanation of value. Command of the commodity over labor is very good and is absolutely characteristic of the nature of capital. The same author makes the following correct observation directed against West. The author of the essay observes that more will be given for labor when there is most increase of stock, and that will be when profits on stock are highest. The greater the profits of stock, he adds, the higher will be the wages of labor. The fault of this is that a word or two is left out. The greater have been the profits of stock, the higher will be the wages of labor. The high profits and the high wages are not simultaneous. They do not occur in the same bargain. The one counteracts the other and reduces it to a level. It might as well be argued the supply of a commodity is most rapid when the price is highest. Therefore, large supply and large price go together. It is a mixing up of cause and effect. Hodgkin's proposition, therefore, has meaning only if, as a result of the process of accumulation, more capital is set in motion by the same workers, or if the capital grows in relation to labor. That is, if, for example, the capital was 100 and becomes 110 by accumulation, and if the same worker who produced the surplus value of 10 is to produce a surplus value of 11, corresponding to the growth of capital, i.e. compound interest. So that it is not simply the same capital he set in motion previously, which after its reproduction is to yield the same profit, simple profit, but this capital has been increased by his surplus labor, so that he has to provide surplus labor for the original capital, or its value, and also for his own accumulated, capitalized surplus labor. And since this capital increases every year, the same worker would constantly have to furnish more labor. It is, however, only under the following conditions possible for more capital to be applied per worker. First, if the productive power of labor remains the same, then this is only possible if the worker prolongs his working time absolutely, i.e., for example, if he works 15 hours instead of 12, or if he works more intensively and performs 15 hours labor in 12 hours, does 5 hours labor in 4 hours, or 1 hour's labor in 4/5 of an hour. Since he reproduces his means of subsistence in a definite number of hours, then in this case, 3 hours of labor are won for the capitalist in the same way as if the productive power of labor had been increased, while in fact, it is labor which has been increased, not its productive power. If the intensification of labor were to become general, then the value of commodities would fall in proportion to the reduced labor time which they cost. The degree of intensity would become the average intensity of labor, its natural quality. If, however, this only occurs in particular spheres, then it amounts to more complex labor, simple labor raised to a higher power. Less than an hour of more intensive labor then counts as much and creates as much value as an hour of the more extensive labor. For example, in the above case, 4/5 of an hour produces as much as 5/5, or an hour. Both the extension of labor time and the increase of labor through its greater intensification, by means of the compression of the pores of labor as it were, have their limits, although the London bakers, for example, regularly work 17 hours a day, if not more. Very definite, physical limitations, and it is when encountering these that compound interest, composite profit, ceases. Within these limitations, the following applies. If the capitalist pays nothing for the extension or intensification of labor, then his surplus value, his profit as well, provided there is no change in the value of the constant capital, for we assume that the mode of production remains the same, and in accordance with this, his profit increases more rapidly than his capital. He pays no necessary labor for the capital which has been added. If he pays for the surplus labor at the same rate as previously, then the growth of the surplus value is proportionate to the increase in capital. The profit grows more rapidly, for there is a more rapid turnover of fixed capital, while the more intensive use of the machinery does not cause the wear and tear to increase at the same rate. There is a reduction of expenditure on fixed capital, for less machinery, workshops, etc. are required for 100 workers who work longer hours than for 200 workers employed simultaneously. Likewise, fewer overseers, etc. This gives rise to a most satisfactory situation for the capitalist, who is able to expand or contract his production without hindrance in accordance with the market conditions. In addition, his power grows, since that portion of labor which is overemployed has its counterpart in an unemployed or semi-employed reserve army, so that competition amongst the workers increases. Although there is, in this case, no change in the purely numerical ratio between necessary labor and surplus labor, this is, however, the only case where both can simultaneously increase in the same proportion, the exploitation of labor has nevertheless grown, both by means of an extension of the working day and by its intensification, condensation, provided the working day is not shortened at the same time, as with the 10 hours bill. The period for which the worker is fit to work is reduced and his labor power is exhausted in a much greater measure than his wages increase, and he becomes even more of a work machine. But disregarding the latter aspect, if he lives for 20 years working a normal working day, and only 15 years when his working day is extended and intensified, then he sells the value of his labor power in 15 years in the latter case and in 20 years in the former. In one case, it has to be replaced in 15 years, in the other in 20. A value of 100, which lasts for 20 years, is replaced if 5% is paid on it annually, for 5 times 20 is 100. A value of 100 which lasts 15 years is replaced if 6 2/3% is paid on it annually. But in the given case, the worker received for 3 hours of additional labor only an amount equivalent to the daily value of his labor calculated over 20 years. Assuming that he works 8 hours necessary labor and 4 hours surplus labor, then he receives 2/3 of each hour, for 12 times 2 over 3 being 8. And in the same way, he receives 2 out of the 3 hours overtime that he works, or 2/3 of each hour. But this is only the value of his hourly labor power on the assumption that it will last for 20 years. If he uses it up in 15 years, its value per hour increases. Anticipation of the future, real anticipation, occurs in the production of wealth only in relation to the worker and to the land. The future can indeed be anticipated and ruined in both cases by premature overexertion and exhaustion, and by the disturbance of the balance between expenditure and income. In capitalist production, this happens to both the worker and the land. As far as so-called anticipation is concerned, in relation to the national debt, for example, Ravenstone marks with justice, "In pretending to stave off the expenses of the present hour to a future day, in pretending that you can burden posterity to supply the wants of the existing generation, they in reality assert the monstrous proposition that you can consume what does not yet exist, that you can feed on provisions before their seeds have been sown in the earth." All the wisdom of our statesmen will have ended in a great transfer of property from one class of persons to another, in creating an enormous fund for the reward of jobs and peculation. It is different in the case of the worker and the land. What is expended here exists as power, and the lifespan of this power is shortened as a result of accelerated expenditure. Finally, if the capitalist is forced to pay more for overtime than for normal working time, then according to the facts outlined above, this is by no means an increase in wages, but only compensation for the increased value of overtime. And in reality, overtime pay is rarely sufficient to cover this. In fact, in order to pay for the increased wear and tear of the labor power, when overtime is worked, a higher rate ought to be paid for every working hour, not merely for the additional hours. Thus, there is, in any case, an increased exploitation of labor. At the same time, as a result of the accumulation of capital, a reduction in surplus value takes place at all events, and also a decline in the rate of profit, insofar as this is not counteracted by saving on constant capital. This is therefore a situation where, in consequence of the accumulation of capital, of the appearance of compound profit, the rate of profit must decline. If on a capital of £300, the original amount, the rate of profit was 10%, that is, profit came to £30, and if for an additional £100 it is 6%, then profit is £36 for 400. Thus, on the whole, it is 9 for 100, and the rate of profit has fallen from 10% to 9%. But as has been stated, on this basis, if the productivity of labor remains the same, not only must the profit on additional capital fall, but at a certain point it must cease altogether. Thus, the whole accumulation based on this compound profit would be stopped. In this case, the decline in profit is linked with increased exploitation of labor, and the cessation of profit at a certain point is not due to the worker or someone else receiving the whole product of his labor, but to the fact that it is physically impossible to work over and above a certain amount of labor time or to increase the intensity of labor beyond a certain degree. Secondly, the only other case where, with the number of workers remaining constant, more capital is applied per worker, and therefore the additional capital can be laid out and used for the increased exploitation of the same number of workers, occurs when the productivity of labor increases, i.e. the method of production is changed. This presupposes a change in the organic ratio between constant and variable capital. In other words, the increase in the capital in relation to labor is here identical with the increase of constant capital as compared with the variable capital, and in general with the amount of living labor employed. This is where Hodgkin's view merges with the general law which I have outlined. The surplus value, i.e. the exploitation of the worker, increases, but at the same time the rate of profit falls because the variable capital declines as against the constant capital, because in general the amount of living labor falls relatively in comparison with the amount of capital which sets it in motion. A larger portion of the annual product of labor is appropriated by the capitalist under the signboard of capital, and a smaller portion under the signboard of profit. Hence the fantasy of Reverend Thomas Chalmers to the effect that the smaller the amount of the annual product laid out by the capitalists as capital, the larger the profit they pocket. The established church then comes to their assistance and sees to it that a large part of the surplus product is consumed instead of being capitalized. The miserable priest confuses cause with effect. Moreover, with a smaller rate of profit, the amount of profit increases as the size of the capital laid out grows. In addition, the quantity of use value which this smaller proportion represents increases. At the same time, however, this leads to the centralization of capital, since the conditions of production now demand the application of capital on a mass scale. It brings about the swallowing up of the smaller capitalists by the bigger ones, and the decapitalization of the former. This is, once again, only in a different form, the separation of the conditions of labor from labor, for there is still a great deal of self-employment amongst the smaller capitalists. In general, the labor done by the capitalist stands in inverse proportion to the size of his capital, that is, to the degree in which he is a capitalist. This process would soon bring capitalist production to a head if it were not for the fact that alongside the centripetal forces, counteracting tendencies exist, which continuously exert a decentralizing influence. This need not be described here, for it belongs to the chapter dealing with the composition of capitals. It is this separation which constitutes the concept of capital and of primitive accumulation, which then appears as a continual process in the accumulation of capital and here finally takes the form of the centralization of already existing capitals in a few hands, and of many being divested of capital. The fact that the proportionally declining quantity of labor is not fully offset by increased productivity, or that the ratio of surplus labor to the capital expended does not increase at the same rate as the relative amount of labor employed declines, is due partly to the fact that the development of the productive power of labor reduces the value of labor, the necessary labor, only in certain capital investment spheres, and that even in these spheres it does not develop uniformly, and that factors exist which nullify this effect. For example, the workers themselves, although they cannot prevent reductions in real wages, will not permit them to be reduced to the absolute minimum. On the contrary, they achieve a certain quantitative participation in the general growth of wealth. But this growth of surplus labor too is relative, and is only possible within certain limits. In order to make this growth correspond to the demands of the compound interest, the necessary labor time in this case would have to be reduced to zero, in the same way as the surplus labor time had to be extended endlessly in the case considered previously. The rise and fall in the rate of profit, insofar as it is determined by the rise or fall of wages resulting from the conditions of demand and supply in the labor market, or caused by the temporary rise or fall in the prices of necessaries compared with those of luxuries as a result of the changes in demand and supply, and the rise or fall in wages to which this leads, has as little to do with the general law of the rise or fall in the profit rate as the rise or fall in the market prices of commodities has to do with the determination of value in general. This has to be analyzed in the chapter on the real movement of wages. If the conditions of demand and supply are favorable to the workers and wages rise, then it is possible, but by no means certain, that the prices of certain necessaries, especially food, will rise correspondingly for a time. The author of the Inquiry into Those Principles, etc., rightly remarks in this connection, in this case, there will be an increase of demand for necessaries in proportion to that for superfluities, as compared with what would have been the proportion between these two sorts of demand if he had exerted that command, i.e. the capitalist, his command over commodities, to procure things for his own consumption. Necessaries will thereby exchange for more of things in general, and in part at least, these necessaries will be food. He then correctly expresses the Ricardian view as follows. At all events then, the increased price of corn was not the original cause of that rise of wages which made profits fall, but on the contrary, the rise of wages was the cause of the increased price of corn at first, and the nature of land, yielding less and less proportional returns to increased tillage, made that part of the increase of price permanent, prevented a complete reaction from taking place through the principle of population. Hodgkin, and the author of The Source and Remedy, etc., since they explain the fall of profits by the impossibility of living labor to fulfill the demands of compound interest, and although they do not analyze this, are much nearer to the truth than Smith and Ricardo, who explain the fall of profits by the rise in wages, one of them by the rise in real and nominal wages, the other by the rise in nominal wages, with rather a decrease of real wages. Hodgkin and all the other proletarian opponents have enough common sense to emphasize the fact that the proportional number of those who live on profit has increased with the development of capital.
Subsection F. Hodgkin on the social character of labor and on the relation of capital to labor. Now a few concluding passages from Hodgkin's Labor Defended, etc. The treatment of the exchange value of the product, hence of the labor embodied in the commodity, as social labor. Almost every product of art and skill is the result of joint and combined labor. This is the result of capitalist production. So dependent is man on man, and so much does this dependence increase as society advances, that hardly any labor of any single individual is of the least value but as forming part of the great social task. This passage has to be quoted, and in doing so it is necessary to emphasize that it is only on the basis of capitalism that commodity production, or the production of products as commodities, becomes all-embracing and affects the nature of the products themselves. Wherever the division of labor is introduced, the judgment of other men intervenes before the laborer can realize his earnings, and there is no longer anything which we can call natural reward of individual labor. Each laborer produces only some part of a whole, and each part having no value or utility of itself, there is nothing on which the laborer can seize and say, "This is my product, this I will keep to myself." Between the commencement of any joint operation, such as that of making cloth, and the division of its product among the different persons whose combined exertions have produced it, the judgment of men must intervene several times, and the question is,
how much of this joint product should go to each of the individuals whose united labor produced it. I know no way of deciding this but by leaving it to be settled by the unfettered judgments of the laborers themselves. I must add that it is doubtful whether one species of labor is more valuable than another. Certainly, it is not more necessary. Finally, Hodgkin writes about the relation of capital and labor. Masters are laborers as well as their journeymen. In this character, their interest is precisely the same as that of their men. But they are also either capitalists or the agents of the capitalist, and in this respect, their interest is decidedly opposed to the interest of their workmen. The widespread of education among the journeyman mechanics of this country diminishes daily the value of the labor and the skill of almost all masters and employers by increasing the number of persons who possess their peculiar knowledge. But put the capitalist, the oppressive middleman, out of view, then it is plain that capital, or the power to employ labor, and coexisting labor are one, and productive capital and skilled labor are also one. Consequently, capital and a laboring population are precisely synonymous. In the system of nature, mouths are united with hands and with intelligence. The capitalist mode of production disappears with the form of alienation which the various aspects of social labor bear to one another and which is represented in capital. This is the conclusion arrived at by Hodgkin. The primitive accumulation of capital includes the centralization of the conditions of labor. It means that the conditions of labor acquire an independent existence in relation to the worker and to labor itself. This historical act is the historical genesis of capital, the historical process of separation which transforms the conditions of labor into capital, and labor into wage labor. This provides the basis for capitalist production. Accumulation of capital on the basis of capital itself, and therefore also on the basis of the relationship of capital and wage labor, reproduces the separation and the independent existence of material wealth as against labor on an ever-increasing scale. Concentration of capital. Accumulation of large amounts of capital by the destruction of the smaller capitals, attraction, decapitalization of the intermediate links between capital and labor. This is only the last degree in the final form of the process, which transforms the conditions of labor into capital, then reproduces capital and the separate capitals on a larger scale, and finally separates from their owners the various capitals which have come into existence at many points of society, and centralizes them in the hands of big capitalists. It is in this extreme form of the contradiction and conflict that production, even though in alienated form, is transformed into social production. There is social labor, and in the real labor process, the instruments of production are used in common. As functionaries of the process which at the same time accelerates this social production, and thereby also the development of the productive forces, the capitalists become superfluous in the measure that they, on behalf of society, enjoy the usufruct, and that they become overbearing as owners of this social wealth and commanders of social labor. Their position is similar to that of the feudal lords, whose exactions, in the measure that their services became superfluous with rise of bourgeois society, became mere outdated and inappropriate privileges, and who therefore rushed headlong to destruction. Subsection G. Hodgkin's basic propositions as formulated in his book, Popular Political Economy. Easy labor is only transmitted skill, but as all the advantages derived from the division of labor naturally center in and belong to the laborers, if they are deprived of them, and in the progress of society those are only enriched by the improved skill who never labor, this must arise from unjust appropriation, from usurpation and plunder in the party enriched, and from consenting submission in the party impoverished. The laborers, to be sure, multiply too rapidly when that multiplication is only compared with the want of the capitalist for their services. Mr. Malthus points out the effects which an increase in the number of laborers has in lessening the share which each one receives of the annual produce, the portion of that distributed amongst them being a definite and determinate quantity, not regulated in any degree by what they annually create. Labor is the exclusive standard of value, but labor, the creator of all wealth, is not a commodity. Regarding the influence of money on the expansion of wealth, Hodgkin remarks correctly, "As a man can dispose of small portions of produce that is corruptible for what is incorruptible, he is under no temptation to throw it away, and thus the use of money adds to wealth by preventing waste." The chief advantage of retail trade derives from the fact that the quantity in which commodities are best produced is not that in which they are best distributed. Both the theory relative to capital and the practice of stopping labor at that point where it can produce, in addition to the subsistence of the laborer, a profit for the capitalist seem opposed to the natural laws which regulate production.
With regard to the accumulation of capital, Hodgkin advances roughly the same ideas as those contained in his first book. Nevertheless, for the sake of completeness, we will reproduce the main passages. Taking only fixed capital into consideration, the subject most favorable to the idea of capital aiding production, for this purpose, we may distinguish three classes of circumstances under which the effects of an accumulation of capital will be very different. First, if it is made and used by the same persons, every accumulation in his possession of the instruments he makes and uses facilitates his labor. The limit to such an accumulation is the power of the laborers to make and use the instruments in question. Second, if it be made and used by different persons, who share between them in just proportion the produce of their combined labor, capital may be made by one laborer and used by another. Both may divide the commodity in proportion as each has contributed by his labor to produce it. I should rather express this fact, however, by saying that a part of the society employed in making instruments, while another part uses them, is a branch of division of labor which aids productive power and adds to the general wealth. As long as the produce of the two classes of laborers be divided between them, the accumulation or increase of such instruments as they can make and use is as beneficial as if they were made and used by one person. Third, if it be owned by a class of persons who neither make nor use it, the capitalist, being the mere owner of the instruments, is not as such a laborer. He in no manner assists production. In other words, production is assisted by the instrument, but not by the title which A holds to the instrument, i.e. not by the circumstance that the instrument is owned by a non-laborer. He acquires possession of the produce of one laborer which he makes over to another, either for a time, as is the case with most kinds of fixed capital, or forever, as is the case with wages, whenever he thinks it can be used or consumed for his advantage. He never does allow the produce of one laborer, when it comes into his possession, to be either used or consumed by another unless it is for his benefit. He employs or lends his property to shore the produce, or natural revenue, of laborers, and every accumulation of such property in his hands is a mere extension of his power over the produce of labor, and retards the progress of national wealth. This is at present the case. When the capitalist, being the owner of all the produce, will allow laborers neither to make nor use instruments unless he obtains a profit over and above the subsistence of the laborer, it is plain that bounds are set to productive labor much within what nature prescribes. In proportion as capital in the hands of a third party is accumulated, so the whole amount of profit required by the capitalist increases, and so there arises an artificial check to production and population. In the present state of society, the laborers being in no case owners of capital, every accumulation of it adds to the amount of profit demanded from them, and extinguishes all that labor which would only procure the laborer his comfortable subsistence. When it is admitted that labor produces all things, even capital, it is nonsense to attribute productive power to the instruments labor makes and uses. Wages do not, like instruments, facilitate production. Labor, not capital, pays all wages. The greater part of the advances of the capitalists consists of such promises. The invention and employment of paper money had done nothing else but show the incorrectness of the notion that capital is something saved. As long as the capitalist, to realize his wealth, or command over other people's labor, was obliged to have in his possession an actual accumulation of the precious metals, or of commodities, we might have continued to suppose that accumulation of capital was the result of an actual saving, and that it depended on the progress of society. But when paper money and parchment securities were invented, when the possessor of nothing but such a piece of parchment received an annual revenue in pieces of paper with which he obtained whatever was necessary for his own use and consumption, and not giving away all the pieces of paper, was richer at the end of the year than at the beginning, or was entitled next year to receive a still greater number of pieces of paper, obtaining a still greater command over the produce of labor, it became evident that capital was not anything saved, and that the individual capitalist did not grow rich by an actual and material saving, but by doing something which enabled him to obtain more of the produce of other men's labor. The master manufacturer has either money or paper with which he pays wages. Those wages his laborer exchanges for the produce of other laborers, who will not keep the wages, whether money or paper, and that is returned to the manufacturer, who gives in exchange for it the cloth which his own laborers have made. With it he again pays wages, and the money or paper again goes the same round. It ascribes to the capitalist's property, merely whether he employs it to pay wages or whether it consists in useful instruments, all that vast assistance which knowledge and skill, when realized in machinery, give to labor. The united labors of the miner, the smelter, the smith, the engineer, the stoker, and of numberless other persons, and not the lifeless machines, perform whatever is done by steam engines. By the common mode of speaking, the productive power of this skill is attributed to its visible products, the instruments, the mere owners of which, who neither make nor use them, imagine themselves to be very productive persons. As their numbers are increased, both increased production and consumption take place, which is all that is ever meant by the terms accumulation or increase of national wealth. Subsection H. Hodgkin on the power of capital and on the upheaval in the right of property. At present, all the wealth of society goes first into the possession of the capitalist, and even most of the land has been purchased by him. He pays the landowner his rent, the laborer his wages, the tax and tithe gatherer their claims, and keeps a large, indeed the largest and continually augmenting share of the annual produce of labor for himself. The capitalist may now be said to be the first owner of all the wealth of the community, though no law has conferred on him the right to this property. This change has been effected by the taking of interest on capital and by the process of compound interest, and it is not a little curious that all the lawgivers of Europe endeavored to prevent this by statutes, viz. Statutes against usury. The power of the capitalist over all the wealth of the country is a complete change in the right of property, and by what law or series of laws was it effected? Section 4. Bray as an opponent of the economists. J.F. Bray, Labor's Wrongs and Labor's Remedy, etc., published in Leeds in 1839. Since human existence is determined by labor, and labor presupposes instruments of labor, quote, the great field for all exertion and the raw material of all wealth, the earth, is the common property of all its inhabitants. Life is dependent upon food, food upon labor. Those dependencies are absolute. Therefore, if labor be evaded by any human being, it can be thus evaded by individuals only on the condition of increased labor by the mass. All the wrongs and the woes which man has ever committed or endured may be traced to the assumption of a right in the soil by certain individuals and classes to the exclusion of other individuals and classes. The next step which man has ever taken after having claimed property in land has been to claim property in man. Bray declares that his purpose is fighting them, the economists, upon their own ground and with their own weapons, in order to prove that poverty need not be the lot of the workers under every social system. Before the conclusions arrived at by such a course of proceeding can be overthrown, the economists must unsay or disprove those established truths and principles on which their arguments are founded. According to the economists, the production of wealth requires firstly, labor, secondly, accumulation of previous labor, or capital, and thirdly, exchange. These are, according to the economists themselves, the universal conditions of production. They are applied to society at large, and from their nature cannot exempt any individual or any class from their operation. The ban, thou shalt labor, rests alike on all created beings. Man can only escape this law, and from its nature it can be evaded by one man only at the expense of another. From the very nature of labor and exchange, strict justice not only requires, in this context, Bray refers to the economic definitions of the exchange value of commodities, that all exchangers should be mutually, but that they should likewise be equally benefited. If a just system of exchanges were acted upon, the value of all articles would be determined by the entire cost of production, and equal values should always exchange for equal values. The workmen have given the capitalist the labor of a whole year in exchange for the value of only half a year, and from this has arisen the inequality of wealth and power which at present exists around us. It is an inevitable condition of inequality of exchanges, of buying at one price and selling at another, that capitalists shall continue to be capitalists, and working men be working men, the one a class of tyrants and the other a class of slaves, to eternity. By the present system, exchanges are not only not mutually beneficial to all parties, as the political economists have asserted, but it is plain that there is, in most transactions between the capitalist and the producer, no exchange whatever. What is it that the capitalist, whether he be manufacturer or banded proprietor, gives for the labor of the working man? The capitalist gives no labor, for he does not work. He gives no capital, for his store of wealth is being perpetually augmented. The capitalist cannot make an exchange with anything that belongs to himself. The whole transaction, therefore, plainly skews that the capitalist and proprietors do no more than give the working man for his labor of 1 week a part of the wealth which they obtained from him the week before, which just amounts to giving him nothing for something. The wealth which the capitalist appears to give in exchange for the workman's labor was generated neither by the labor nor the riches of the capitalist, but it was originally obtained by the labor of the workman, and it is still daily taken from him by a fraudulent system of unequal exchanges. The whole transaction between the producer and the capitalist is a palpable deception, a mere farce. The law which says there shall be accumulation is only half fulfilled and is made to subserve the interests of a particular class to the detriment of all the rest of the community. Under the present social system, the whole of the working class are dependent upon the capitalist or employer for the means of labor, and where one class, by its position in society, is thus dependent upon another class for the means of labor, it is dependent likewise for the means of life. And this is a condition so contrary to the very intention of society, so revolting to reason, that it cannot for one moment be palliated or defended. It confers on man a power which ought to be vested in nothing mortal. Our daily experience teaches us that if we take a slice from a loaf, the slice never grows on again. The loaf is but an accumulation of slices, and the more we eat of it, the less will there remain to be eaten. Such is the case with the loaf of the working man, but that of the capitalist follows not this rule. His loaf continually increases instead of diminishing. With him, it is cut and come again forever. If exchanges were equal, would the wealth of the present capitalists gradually go from them to the working classes? Every shilling that the rich man spent would leave him a shilling less rich. Bray also shows in his work that it is impossible that any capitalist can have derived even £1,000 from the actual hoarded labor of his working class progenitors. It follows from the teachings of the economists themselves that there can be no exchanges without accumulations, no accumulations without labor. Under the present system, every working man gives to an employer at least 6 days' labor for an equivalent worth only 4 or 5 days' labor. The gains of the last man are necessarily the losses of the first man. Thus, in whatever light the genesis of wealth is examined, whether as a gift, individual accumulation, exchange, inheritance, there is proof upon proof that there is a flaw in the rich man's title which takes away at once its very show of justice and its value. This wealth has all been derived from the bones and sinews of the working classes during successive ages, and it has been taken from them by the fraudulent and slavery-creating system of unequal exchanges. If a working man under the present system would become wealthy, he, instead of exchanging his own labor, must become a capitalist, or exchanger of the labor of other people, and thus by plundering others in the same manner as he was plundered, through the medium of unequal exchanges, he will be enabled to acquire great gains from the small losses of other people. The political economists and capitalists have written and printed many books to impress upon the working man the fallacy that the gain of the capitalist is not the loss of the producer. We are told that labor cannot move one step without capital, that capital is as a shovel to the man who digs, that capital is just as necessary to production as labor itself is. This mutual dependency between capital and labor has nothing to do with the relative position of the capitalist and the working man, nor does it show that the former should be maintained by the latter. It is the capital, and not the capitalist, that is essential to the operations of the producer, and there is as much difference between the two as there is between the actual cargo and the bill of lading. From the relation which capital and labor bear to each other, it is evident that the more capital or accumulated produce there is in a country, the greater will be the facilities for production, and the less labor will it require to obtain a given result. Thus, the people of Great Britain, with the aid of their present vast accumulations of capital, their buildings, machinery, ships, canals, and railways, can produce more manufactured wealth in 1 week than their ancestors of 1,000 years since could have created in half a century. It is not our superior physical powers, but our capital, which enables us to do this. For wherever there is a deficiency of capital, production will progress slowly and laboriously, and vice versa. From these considerations, then, it is apparent that whatever is gained to capital is likewise gained to labor, that every increase of the former tends to diminish the toil of the latter, and that therefore every loss to capital must also be a loss to labor. This truth, though long since observed by the political economists, has never yet been fairly stated by them. In fact, the fellows argue in the following way. Accumulated products of labor, i.e. products not consumed, lighten labor and make it more productive. As a consequence, the fruits of this lightening, and so on, must go not to labor itself, but to accumulation. Consequently, it is not accumulation which must be the property of labor, but labor must be the property of accumulation. That is, it must be the property of its own products. Consequently, the worker must not accumulate for himself, but for someone else, and the accumulation must confront him as capital. For the economists, the material element of capital is so integrated with its social form as capital, with its antagonistic character as the product of labor dominating labor, that they cannot write a single sentence without contradicting themselves. They have even identified capital with one class of the community and labor with another class, although the two powers have naturally, and should have artificially, no such connection. The economists always attempt to make the prosperity, if not the very existence of the working man, dependent upon the condition of maintaining the capitalist in luxury and idleness. They would not have the working man to eat a meal unless he has produced two, one for himself and the other for his master, the latter receiving his portion indirectly by unequal exchanges. When the workman has produced a thing, it is his no longer. It belongs to the capitalist. It has been conveyed from one to the other by the unseen magic of unequal exchanges. Under the present social system, capital and labor, the shovel and the digger, are two separate and antagonistic powers.
But even if all the land and the machinery and the houses did belong to the capitalists, and the working class were not in being, the former would not thereby be enabled to evade the great contradiction that there shall be labor. Their wealth would leave them in the choice only of working or starving. They cannot eat the land and the houses, and the land will not yield sustenance, nor the machinery make clothing without the application of human labor. Therefore, when the capitalists and proprietors say that the working class must support them, they likewise say in effect that the producers belong to them as well as the houses and lands do, that the working man was created only for the rich man's use. The producer receives, in exchange for what he gives to the capitalist, not the labor nor the produce of the labor of the capitalist, but work. Through the instrumentality of money, the working class are not only compelled to perform the labor which the preservation of existence naturally imposes upon them, but they are likewise saddled with the labor of other classes. It matters not whether the producers now receive gold or silver or other commodities from a non-producing class. It all amounts to this, that the working class performs their own labor and support themselves, and likewise perform the labor of the capitalist, and maintain him into the bargain. Whatever may be the nominal receipts which the producers receive from the capitalists, their actual receipts are the transfer of that labor which ought to be rendered by the capitalists. We will suppose the population of the United Kingdom to be 25 million of human beings. We may estimate the entire maintenance of the 25 millions of people to be worth, on the average, at least £15 per head annually. This gives £375 million as the yearly value of the maintenance of the whole people of the United Kingdom. We do not, however, employ ourselves merely in producing articles of subsistence, for our labor creates likewise many unconsumable articles. We every year add to our stock of accumulation, or capital, by increasing the number of our houses, ships, implements, machines, roads, and other assistance to further production, beside making good all wear and tear. Thus, although our subsistence may be worth but 375 million sterling a year, the total annual value of the wealth created by the people will not be less than 500 million sterling. We cannot calculate upon having above 1/4 of our population, or about 6 millions of men, that is, those between the ages of 14 and 50, as effective producers. Of this number, scarcely 5 millions can be said, under the present arrangements, to assist in production. Bray writes later on that only 4 millions are directly employed in actual production. For thousands of able-bodied men are compelled to stand idle while the work which they ought to do is being performed by women and children, and hundreds of thousands of men in Ireland can obtain no employment whatever. Thus, less than 5 millions of men, assisted by a few thousands of women and children, have to create produce for 25 millions. The present number of working men, if unassisted by machinery, could not support themselves and the present number of idlers and unprofitable laborers. The agricultural and manufacturing machinery of every kind which we bring to our aid in the business of productions has been computed to perform the labor of about 100 millions of effective men. This machinery and its application under the present system, which has generated the hundreds of thousands of idolaters and livers on profit who now press the working class into the earth. The present constitution of society has been fertilized by machinery, and by machinery will it be destroyed. The machinery itself is good, is indispensable. It is the application of it, the circumstance of its being possessed by individuals instead of by the nation, that is bad. The 5 millions of men, already enumerated as assisting in production, will include all who labor little or much. Some do not work 5 hours a day, while others toil on 15 hours. And when to this is added the time lost by the compulsory idleness of great numbers in times of depression in trade, it will be found that our annual production is created and distributed by less than 1/5 of the community, working on the average 10 hours a day. We suppose that the wealthy non-producers of every description, with their families and dependents, amount to only 2 millions of persons. Yet, this number alone would cost the working classes 230 million annually if their maintenance were averaged, like that of the latter, at £15 per head. Therefore, upon the most moderate computation, their maintenance will cost not less than £50 per head. This gives a total of £100 million sterling as the annual cost of the mere drones of society, the utterly unproductive. Likewise, the double and quadruple allowance received by the various classes of small proprietors, manufacturers, and tradesmen in the shape of profit and interest. Upon the most moderate computation, the share of wealth enjoyed by this extensive portion of the community will amount to not less than £140 million annually, above the average of what is received by an equal number of the best paid of the working class. Thus, along with their government, the two classes of idlers and livers on profit, comprising perhaps 1/4 of the entire population, absorb about £300 million annually, or above 1/2 of the entire wealth produced. An average loss of above £50 per head to every working man in the empire. This leaves no more than an average of £11 per head per annum, to be divided amongst the remaining 3/4 of the nation. From calculations made in 1815, it appears that the annual income of the whole people of the United Kingdom amounted to about £430 million, of which the working class received 99,742,547, and the rent, pension, and profit class 330,778,825. The whole property of the country was at the same time calculated to be worth nearby 3,000 millions of pounds sterling.